CD 6.
The days the guns were run in and out in dumb show to exercise the crews were worth attention, each action timed and commented on by the watch-holding Captain Dawes. Poor results getting the lieutenants in charge a roasting. The next attempt expected to show visible improvement, for here was the seat of British naval superiority, the ability to load and fire their cannon faster than any enemy and to sail their ship with greater skill of manoeuvre. There was boarding practice to follow, as well as the concomitant need to rehearse how to repel the reverse act, which had the deck full of men supposed to be fighting in dumb show, but using it to entertain themselves or settle scores, which gave work to Surgeon Lutyens. Pearce also took great interest in the fencing practice carried out by the lieutenants and midshipmen, and since no one barred him from instruction, he took to aiding the younger mids in their swordplay. Valuable instruction, given he had been taught in Paris by a master of the art. Odd how his competence produced on the faces of his wardroom companions looks of malevolence. They did not care for the notion that this upstart had any ability at all. Each noon the midshipmen gathered with their sextants to shoot the sun at its zenith, thus marking the beginning and end of the naval day, and he had to admit some of these boys did that task with an aplomb he would struggle to match. Then it was back to the schoolroom for those not on watch, to attend their lessons in mathematics and navigation, that followed by a certain amount of skylarking in the rigging. Given the master was not ill-disposed towards him, he talked to him often, asking about the sail plan and why various strips of canvas were being employed and not others, discussing the state of the sea and currents, learning by absorption those things which stood as the accumulated knowledge of generations of seamen, acutely aware that he was lacking in the deep learning that made for better than competent sailors. They encountered no ships going north, but many passed them heading south, including one massive convoy which included East Indiamen of the same size and displacement of the ship on which Pearce stood, each deep laden with goods that, all told, must have run into millions, and even he could see they had suffered some recent storm damage and were undergoing floating repairs. 2 days later they came across further evidence of a heavy storm, when the lookout aloft warned of a hazard in the water dead ahead, which, when they hove to alongside, looked to be the top half of a mainmast, and included a tangle of rigging and ripped canvas. Prepared to let it drift by, one sharp eye spotted a body in amongst the labyrinth of ropes, wood, and sailcloth, so a boat was put over the side to find what was a dead body, bloated by immersion, but unmistakably Alaska. "Could be off any ship, Mr. Pearce," said the master, "but given we just missed that frigate from the Bay of Bengal, it would not shock me to find he's from her. It must have been a hell of a storm, and thank God we missed it, sir, for we have had enough foul weather for one cruise." "We might have more." "True," Mr. Loudon replied, looking grim, "so let us hope the timbers of old Granny Grampus are not too injured by what we have endured up till now." There was discussion about what kind of ceremony should attend the interment of a man from the Far East, but in the end he was sewn in canvas with a shot at his feet and slipped into the ocean by use of the Anglican rite. For all it was sad, John Pearce saw it as relieving the boredom, almost wishing he had duties to perform to keep him occupied. With Michael, Charlie, and Rufus he could exchange only a few brief words. Naval convention discouraged chats between the lower deck and officers, and there were precious few places on a ship that were not under observation by someone. Nor, without permission, could he go aloft, for that required a nod from the quarter-deck, and he would not ask for it. And like a leitmotif, day in, day out, and at night as well, came the clanking sound of the pumps, as the endless battle to keep at bay the level of the water in the well went on. "I know you are feeling better, husband, just by the colour of your cheeks. There is blood where so recently there was pallor." "I still feel great pain, Mrs. Barclay, and as you know, I still require the surgeon to treat me with tincture of laudanum." "I should have a care not to rely on it too heavily. Mr. Lutyens tells me he has known of cases where patients, once they have formed the habit, cannot rid themselves of it.
I hope you know me well enough to discern that I am of a stronger character than that.
Emily had watched the fencing practice on the foredeck as much as anyone, and she could see the similarity to what was taking place now. Verbal thrust, conversational parry, and no intimacy whatsoever. They were not in the least comfortable in one another's presence, and she lacked either the will or the inclination to alter that state of affairs, while underlying everything was the knowledge she had acquired so surreptitiously while the ship lay at anchor. The notion of telling her husband had occurred to her. Forewarned, he might be able to evade some of that coming in his direction. Yet she could no more talk of it to him than she could to John Pearce, and the longer that went on, the harder it became. Several times, seeing him on deck and knowing he was well disposed towards her, she had sought to plead that he drop the matter for the sake of her and her family. But the words would no more come than they would now, and this to the man she should tell. Whatever else, they were bound together by the tight bonds of holy matrimony.
My dear, we cannot continue like this.
That he had spoken so shocked her into paying attention.
I am aware that I have in some way offended you, but I am forced to counter that you have likewise distressed me.
Tempted to say, by pointing out your failings, she remained silent.
I have some hope that time will heal the rift between us, and I also know that continued propinquity will not serve that aim. I refer, of course, to you accompanying me to sea to share my cabin. He moved his stump. This will heal in time, and I have high hopes of another command. Perhaps something of the nature of Grampus might be seen as my due.
Suddenly he smiled, but it was more of a rictus grin than truly anything warm. He was so obviously thinking of his own future happiness, not theirs. "Then I can only wish you joy of it, sir," Emily replied.
Naturally, when we land in England, I will require a period of convalescence, and that will have to be taken at home, though the waters in Bath will not be out of the question, given they are efficacious, but—"
She knew she had to pick up on his silence. "You are concerned, sir, that my behaviour may embarrass you."
"I know, Mrs. Berkeley, if it continues in this vein, it is bound to."
"I am not well versed in subterfuge."
"That," he said in a sharper tone, "is mere dissimulation. You know of what I speak. I have my sisters, and you have your family. We cannot act like this before them without drawing them into some concern for the state of our marriage, and, I might add, I have no wish to be the subject of gossip for every tongue in Frome."
"And what, Captain Berkeley, would you say is the state of our marriage? Have you forgotten how cruelly you last used me?"
"I exercise my rights as a husband, madam, and while I would have you willing, I will have you when I must."
He was struggling to contain himself, and Emily could see it was getting harder. He would have been happier if she had shouted at him, or wept with the shame of her near rape, the way he had taken her brutally and without consent while in drink, the very act which had caused her to move to the St. Mondrier hospital. The calm tone of each response was doing nothing to cool his ire. He was finding that increasingly irritating. Memory of that assault was working on her temper too, so that she had to struggle to stay composed. "Then I have to tell you, sir, that as of this moment I fear you will have to employ such methods, should you wish to exercise them again."
"Are you saying you will not perform your wifely duty, madam?"
Ralph Berkeley could not shout. There were too many ears on a ship, not least doors in his main part of the cabin. But he wanted to, just as he wanted to do to his wife what he had done in the cabin of HMS Brilliant. If she would not give him his conjugal rights willingly, then he had the right in law to take them. But the proximity of others was not the only constraint on such an act. With one arm, and that as yet to fully heal, he was only too well aware he could not manage it.
"Then I must tell you," he hissed, "that I will have you adhere to your marriage vows, and I would warn you, madam, that I have shots in my locker which will make life unpleasant for more than me. Do not force me to act in a manner that will bring about harm to others, and I know that is a subject on which I do not need to elaborate."
Nor did he. Emily knew only too well that her family kept the house in which she had been born only on her husband's generosity. The property was entailed, and he, having inherited that, could throw them out of it at will. "Captain Berkeley, I promise this and no more, to be polite, to show in public acquiescence, to always treat you with respect. But in private I will be what I am."
"Then your first act will be to move from the sick bay to take up your quarters here. You will also take your meals with Captain Dawes and myself."
Emily stood up. "You have about you, sir, a tone that is reprehensible. One you no doubt employ on those poor unfortunates obliged to serve under you. I do not and will not respond as they are constrained to do. And as to your request that I share this cabin, all I will say is that I will consider it." With that she swept out, to pass Cornelius Gerson sitting in a small cabin to the side, the look on his absurdly handsome face, his knowing smile, designed to let her know he had heard every word. Devereux was up to his old tricks, though discreetly, since he had been warned by some of the harder bargains on the Grampus to mind himself. But in any ship's company there were those who could be terrorized into passing over their grog, and made to do so in a manner that ensured they did not pass on to others what was happening. The consumption of it also had to be carried out with prudence, so it was necessary to find a quiet spot where he could sit unobserved and consume what he saw as his good fortune. While happy on shore to get drunk with friends, he nevertheless did not find companionship was required, being quite content with his own company and the grog he had accumulated. Sat in the sail locker, sure with the ship sailing easy on the big Atlantic swell nothing would blow out and need replacement, he was alone with his own thoughts, which turned to talk as the drink took hold. Happiness, as most men understood it, was not a concept Devereux would have been able to comprehend. He was a bully who used his fists to get his way, and only ever gave ground to superior force. That was what Ralph Berkeley had, his rank and the power it gave him. Some men saw him as a hard horse. Devereux saw him as fair. Labouring on a farm when news came that a war was in the offing, he had gathered up his belongings and made his way to where he could find out who was getting what in the article of a ship, and he never doubted that Ralph Berkeley would be in line. Was he not a fine seaman and a fighter? HMS Brilliant was a tad smaller than he had anticipated, but a berth was a berth. If he noticed, when he came aboard as a volunteer, the greeting was not entirely wholehearted from his hero, it did nothing to dent his pleasure in once more serving a man he admired. Of course, he got flogged, as he had been on previous commissions, and by damn he deserved it, for if he had gathered enough, he was a bad bastard who might start to imbibe in secret, but would want to let the world know his thoughts when the drink took effect. For Devereux the Navy was home, in truth the only one he had ever truly had, having been raised in a workhouse in which he had learnt that punishment went with offence, and the level of both that and the wrongdoing was to be decided by others. That was the way of the world, and not to be gainsaid by the likes of him. Steadily he drank, feeling the warmth spread through his body as fast as the thoughts raced through his mind. The singing started softly enough, a reprisal of all the old ditties he knew, those he had learnt as a ship's boy, crude songs that when sung ashore had passing womenfolk covering their ears. Slowly but surely the memory went from happy recollection and started to cloud with anger. The remembrance of how he had grown to take his vengeance on those who had mistreated him when he was nothing but a skinny nipper, with his ribs easy to see, running back and forth alongside the thick, slimy anchor cable, tying it to the messenger that led to the capstan, sliding, slithering, and sometimes coming to a tumble on the soaking deck, which would earn him a backhander or a clout with a starter. He had run cartridges for the gunner, too, priding himself on being the fastest lad between the handling chamber and the guns he was tasked to serve. Not that he got away without blows then either, for however swift he was, it was never fast enough. Some of those old sailors had treated him hard, the Marines being worse, none of them taking a liking to his lip when berated, and many a swipe round the ear he had got for his cheek. But he had grown to make them suffer, drawing blood for every remembered blow.
"That's what I did see,"
he said, slurring to the lantern he had filched.
"They whacked me good and proper when I were little, but lived to regret it bad when I grew to a height."
Then he laughed.
"I made them buggers bleed, and serves them right, I say."
This recall was made even if it flew in the face of his own habit of clouting nippers if they annoyed him. In fact, Devereux would clout anyone who got his goat. Right then he saw in the guttering tallow the face of Michael O'Hagan.
"That Irish bastard not accepted and all. He might think he bettered me bare knuckle, but he got lucky, that's all. Next time I'll knock that Paddy grin off the stupid papist bugger's face."
O'Hagan's face was only an image, and one distorted by rum, but the fist that swung broke it in half, and the fact that it went on to smash into the planking of the sail locker was not felt, even if it broke the skin. Looking at his hand, Devereux saw it was bleeding at the knuckles, but to his addled mind that was Irish blood, not his. Pulling himself upright, though struggling to stop swaying, Devereux began to take apart an image of every man he had never bested in the one fight they had engaged in. Devereux was no longer in the sail locker. He was in a dozen places where his fists had been employed: taverns, back alleys, 'tween decks, where he had set out to punish. He had no memory of hitting the lantern, or of it falling over so hard the door flew open and the tallow dropped out. Nor did he see or smell the flame begin to singe the bone-dry canvas. It might have been fine if the flame had not also got to some of the rum he had spilt, which flared up quickly, creating enough heat to allow the fire to spread. It was only when the smoke made him cough he realized what was happening, and all he did then was flee, leaving the fire to turn from a hazard, with the aid of the air from an open door, to an inferno. Chapter 15. John Pearce was in the wardroom, sitting on a locker, trying to read Voltaire in the French. Not easy, since his contemporaries seemed intent on annoying him with loud and distracting conversations. Heinrich Lutjens was writing too, copying into his large ledger the notes he had made of the mayhem of music and carnality he had witnessed as the ship lay off Gibraltar, while a few feet away, but out of sight, Emily Barclay was embroidering a sampler. Michael, Rufus, and Charlie were jawing away at a mess table, while Cornelius Gerson was with the purser, who was getting increasingly impatient with his inquiries as to the value of his stores. This while Ralph Barclay lay in his cot dozing, having just been dosed with his pain-relieving tincture. Captain Dawes was at his logs, bringing them up to date from the hastily made notes off which he and his officers would work, each one ensuring that they tallied, so that those nosy buggers at the Navy Office would not spot some anomaly to excite their interest, especially in the article of stopping at Lisbon. This put down to the need to examine the rudder. Feeble, for sure, but enough to avert even the most remote chance of censure. The master was in his hutch off the quarterdeck, plotting the ship's position with his charts, having taken a reading from the slate and employing his protractors, noting down the rate of sailing, making allowance for the currents acting on the deep hull, and thinking that, given the state of the ship's timbers, her progress was as good as could be expected, and that he was heartily glad they had missed the eye of that recent storm. The carpenter and his mate were making their way, crouched down, for the passage was low, along the walk that ran round the hull of the ship, bearing tarred rope, bolsters, and mallets, as well as a bucket of pitch, to hammer into and seal off the seams that were opening excessively. He, too, like the master, thanking his own God for having missed what must have been a typical tempest for the time of year, while at the same time worrying about the waters they were now sailing through, the notorious Bay of Biscay. All heard the cry of, "Fire down below!" the one most dreaded by all on a ship at sea. Dawes was out of his cabin in a flash, in time to hear the order being given by the officer of the watch to get out and rig the fire engine, one which was carried out quickly, the hose going over the side to suck up seawater, while the engine was taken to the seat of the blaze, which was right under the gun-room. All over the ship there were men running, some carrying messages of how bad it was, others, who were by nature pessimistic Jonahs, rushing to where their kit was stored to gather up any money left over from the recent debauches. This, while the Marine Guard was doubled on the spirit room to make sure they did not break in and drink themselves senseless. The terror of fire in a wooden ship was not hard to fathom, but there was a drill to deal with it, one that was practised as often as running the guns in and out, and, had the blaze been caught quickly, it could have been contained. But it had been given time to take hold, and that on timbers seasoned by years of use. The lower holds might be damp, but that did not truly apply to the higher decks. The gunner had rushed to his place of work and had the ship's boys taking any filled cartridges to the upper deck, where if the fire got out of hand they could be chucked into the sea. He knew that the order had gone out to stop pumping, and indeed he wondered if the captain was already taking steps to scuttle the lower decks, which would flood the magazine and render harmless the stores of powder, a wise precaution to avoid them all being blown to perdition. The fight was not going well. From the sail locker it had spread to the bread room, in reality dry hard biscuit, but with enough oil or lard in its consistency to make it highly inflammable, and already it had come through the planking to fill the gun-room with such dense smoke as to make seeking to contain it from above impossible. Above, the rest of the crew were working just as hard. As a precaution, whilst also being part of the well-rehearsed drill, the 4 ship's boats were being hauled off the battens on which they lay across the waist, while at the same time men were working below and on the deck to gather provisions of water and portable food, seen at this stage as a precaution. That took time. The boats were heavy and required hard work on the capstan to get them aloft, then over the bulwarks, so they could be lowered into the water, held in place long enough for what stores had been gathered to be loaded aboard, the whole slower than perfect, with the ship being short-handed. By the time they were in the water, the upper deck had begun to burn, a clear indication that, below, it was out of control, despite the hard work being done by the fire engine, backed up by what men could be mustered passing every bucket the ship carried. Several hands had suffered burns, and were being attended to where they lay by the surgeon. Captain Dawes, also as part of his duties in a drill, but now beginning to appear a necessity, had gathered up the ship's papers, his logs, and the book of recognition signals for British vessels on service. He was enough of a gentleman to have alerted Emily Barclay early on to be prepared to depart the ship. One of the first things Emily had learnt at sea was the need to be tidy. With constant drills, added to the possibility always of sudden action, her clothing had to be kept in its chest, as did all her other belongings not in use, outdoor garments always to hand. So she was able to grab quickly her heavy hooded cloak, a comforter of some length to wrap around her neck, and enough of her possessions that she could decently carry with an emphasis on warmth, it being February in the Atlantic. The midshipman who had told her to prepare had gone. He had other duties to perform, and Lutyens' cabin was empty, given he was occupied. At some point one of his assistants might come to remove his medical chest, but that had not happened yet. It was so easy to enter, less so for a person well brought up to open his instrument chest and lift out those papers. Emily did hesitate, unsure why she wanted them, only aware that she did, while also conscious that what she was doing was morally wrong. She bit her lip hard as they went into the bag with those items she held dear. Ralph Barclay, still light-headed and obviously nauseous from being so rudely awakened, was now being helped from his cot in a smoke-filled cabin by a less than steady Devereux, a man whose breath stank so much of drink that even the half-comatose captain recoiled from the blast. Gerson, irritated, if not near to panic, was helping too, his efforts, because of his agitated state, doing more harm than good. The arrival of the man's wife to supervise his care, as well as to oversee the gathering of what possessions he needed and could be carried, was seen by Gerson as hypocrisy, and he made no secret of his disdain. "Both of you leave him be. He's in more pain with your handling."
"Who are you to tell us what to do, Mrs. Barclay?" Gerson spat, cutting right across her. "The way you treated him."
Emily responded with equal ferocity. "His wife, and I will say at once, if you force him to choose between us, you will be swabbing the decks in an hour. Now let go of him." Bleary-eyed, Devereux looked at her, swaying back and forth in a manner that had nothing to do with the motion of the now stationary ship. Then he touched his forehead and slurred,
"Save him in your presence, ma'am. It needs a strong hand to aid him."
"It needs a steady one. Get away from him."
"My dear,"
Barclay said, his eyes glazed. "Don't speak, husband," she said with a gentility to which he had not been exposed for months. This while she got his cloak round his shoulders. "Let us go, but slowly. There is as yet no need to panic."
"Gerson, my papers."
"I have them, Captain Barclay," he replied, rushing out the door. The sound of retching had Emily concentrating on Devereux, who was now bent over, one hand on the bulkhead, no doubt affected by the smoke, and voiding his gut, so she missed that exchange. Another look around established that Gerson had fled from a place in which it was now becoming painful to breathe. Slowly she helped Ralph Barclay to move forward, leaving Devereux to follow if he wished, vaguely aware that somehow the attitude of those they passed on their way to the deck had changed.
"Mrs. Barclay, you must make your way to the entry port and get aboard the pinnace at once."
"How are—" She never got to finish the question, for Dawes' reply was too swift.
"Bad, Mrs. Barclay, very bad."
Then he turned to a midshipman, a youngster trying and failing to look brave beside him.
"Give orders to scuttle the lower deck."
It was clear from the way the men below, who included the Pelicans, were retreating from the flames, that the fire was winning the battle, not them. The heat was spreading the flames as much as any sparks, and any water thrown on them was immediately turned to scalding steam. Few could stand more than a minute or two at the face of the conflagration, some retiring of their own volition, others requiring to be hauled back as they fell from the effects of the ferocious temperature. Behind them, Lutchins was on his knees trying to ease burns with salve, while his assistants used some of the water in the buckets to douse clothing that was singed and smouldering. To Pearce and those with him, officers, warrants, and hands all toiling without distinction, the world had reduced to that before them, the red and orange inferno crackling as flames jumped forward to set alight timbers, barrels, cannon trunnions, and the tools required to work the guns, that had what little moisture they contained sucked out by the heat. They took turns on the handles of the fire engine, pumping up and down to keep flowing a jet that could only delay, not douse out the flames, backing up time after time as the fire forced retreat. The point of no return was not the smouldering deck planking, with some of the upper deck caulking already burning. It was when flames licked out of the upper scantlings. The Carpenter's Walk, that narrow, low passage that ran right round the ship near the waterline, now slowly sinking under that, was, unknown to those fighting the fire amidships, acting like a funnel to progress it, taking it past them time and time again. Eventually it set alight to those newly hammered-in pieces of pitch, and that acted on the scantlings, fire breaking through to the battens that held not only the shrouds, but also the blocks on which the falls were lashed. Then they caught the rigging, which began to burn quickly, the ropes being heavily impregnated with tar, so that they went up like Roman candles, the flames snaking up towards the now flapping sails. The master, as soon as the alarm was sounded, had ordered the sheets let go, and brought HMS Grampus up into the wind to reduce a draught that was bound to feed the fire. With the whole of the mid-to-stern area alight, the flames beginning to lick at those sails, and the ship settling into the water as her lower deck was flooded, it was obvious HMS Grampus was in dire peril. The order to abandon did not come at that time. Men, officers included, were sent to get what they could from a wardroom cleared by their servants, their sea chests now on the open deck. Especially needed was warm clothing, boat cloaks, and, if they could manage it, foul-weather gear. Just as vital were the instruments by which they would navigate. The last thing of importance, their personal possessions and logs. The captain's servants had moved steadily back and forth to the cutter throughout the past half-hour, carrying the things their master deemed necessary to aid them to survive. John Pearce, blackened as was every man who had been firefighting, found his own chest, thankful to whoever had retrieved it, and flung it open, grabbing Hood's letter, the order releasing his friends from the Navy, as well as the tin of Parisian earth. Then, with his boat cloak bundled in his arms, he set off for the upper deck at a run, intent on trying to get to the other side of the fire and Lutchen's quarters. He wondered if he was too late as soon as he emerged onto the upper deck, and was shocked by the speed at which the fire, no longer being fought, had spread, aided now by gun ports open to allow men to exit to the boats. Flames were shooting up the nearest companionway, as well as billowing smoke, making his aim look impossible. But he tried anyway, glad to see that Michael, Charlie, and Rufus had waited for him as he had asked. They inched along the walk that bordered the waist, now empty of boats, with flames rising and licking at them, seemingly with a life of their own as they sought out flesh to burn. The most forward companionway was clear of fire, and so they moved down together, aware of the increasing heat, making for the next set of steps that would take them down to the orlop deck. All around them men were running for safety, and it was clear that, marine guards notwithstanding, some of them had got into the spirit store and purloined the contents. They were drinking as they ran. Suddenly a bolt of fire shot up from below. Clearly the fire had touched something that acted like a torch. "It's no good, John boy," Michael yelled. "Barclay's court-martial papers are down there," Pearce shouted back, edging towards the companionway. "So is old Nick," Charlie bawled. "Leave it! You go, Michael, get into a boat." The hand that grabbed John Pearce's collar left no room for dispute. He was nearly lifted bodily off his feet and dragged backwards, far enough to hear over the roar of the flames the continually repeated cry of, "Abandon ship!" Eyes streaming, they made their way back up the deck to where the entry port was open and a crowd of men was jostling around it trying to get out. That was when Captain Dawes took charge, his bellow enough to still panic and even the most fearful breast, insisting that there was enough room in the boats for all and that they form an orderly line. When the Pelicans, near to being back markers, got to see daylight, only the cutter, smallest of them all, was left with space to spare. The barge, launch, and pinnace were all standing off, the latter with its masts stepped and already with some canvas rigged. "Pearce, you will command the cutter," said Dawes. "Thank God we are short-handed, and can get everyone off." "Aye, aye, sir," he replied, given there was no choice. "And you, sir?" Dawes looked at him as if the mere posing of the question was tantamount to a hanging offence. "What I am about is none of your concern. Once I'm sure everyone is off the ship, I will call the cutter in." It was a tale oft told of captains going down with their ships, as if to lose one was more damning than life itself. The image of Dawes, who was glaring at him, doing just that, was unmistakable, and this while above their heads they could hear the dislodged spars and blocks thudding into the deck as the fire detached them from the rigging. "Do not be tempted to stay, sir. It is naught but romantic folly." "Do not presume, Mr. Pearce, to tell me my duty," Dawes shouted. "Now get aboard that damned cutter." There was no inclination to disobey. Michael, Rufus, and Charlie had already lowered themselves down the man-ropes, not very far as the ship was still settling, and were now looking up at him. Yet he was not going to leave this fool to his chosen fate, if indeed that was what he intended. He might well signal for the cutter to come and take him off, but then he might not. Suddenly Pearce spun round, and the punch, one of which Michael O'Hagan would have been proud, took an unsuspecting Dawes right on the jaw, and he went down like a sack of dried peas. "Below! Catch the captain! He has inhaled too much smoke!" There was no way to throw the man. He had to be dragged to the edge, and no way to avoid him rumbling down the battens that lined and protruded from the side of the ship. He would be a bruised and battered soul, but at least, John Pearce reckoned, he would be alive. Dawes was caught with no expertise, and throwing his own hastily gathered clothing first, Pearce lowered himself into the cutter, which immediately cast off. By the time they got far enough off to rest the oars and look back, HMS Grampus was alight from end to end. One of the hands had been using sea-water to try and revive his captain, with some success, given his eyes began to open and he began to groan. The man who had administered to him was speaking softly, urging him to come round, which he did eventually, sitting up and nursing his head, that followed by gentle touching of the various parts of his anatomy which had met with those wood battens. That did not last. The head lifted and the eyes fixed on Pearce. "I'll see you swing from the end of a yardarm for that." "What, sir?" asked Pearce, looking innocent. "For laying hands. What am I saying? For punching a superior officer, damn you!" Pearce affected surprise. "I fear the smoke must have harmed you more than I suspected, sir. You collapsed from inhalation, and I was required to help you. I observe a certain amount of pain was caused by that, which I could not help and for which I apologize." "You punched me, Pearce." "Did I, sir?" Pearce replied, eyes open in surprise. Then he looked at the rows of eyes examining him in what was a crowded boat. "Did anyone see me punch the captain?" It was amusing to watch the reaction. Sailors loved a guy and were much given to ribbing their mates. They could not openly shake their heads or nod, because Dawes had turned to scrutinize their reactions. Did he see what Pearce saw in those blank looks? A substitute for mirth? "Barky's going, Your Honour," said one fellow, nodding towards the ship. Every eye fixed on Grampus, then, as she slowly settled, hissing as the fire turned water to steam, not going down by bow or stern, but as if she was lowering herself into her watery grave. She only tipped when water filled the hull, which tilted the burning upper works towards the cutter. But soon they sank too, in that continued, stately fashion, until the last of the top part of the mainmast slid into the sea. Pearce looked at Dawes, then looked away, given the man had tears streaming down his face. "Man the oars," he croaked. "Let us join with the other boats." The figures the master produced, 46 degrees north by some 9 degrees west, put the 4 crowded boats squarely in the middle of the Bay of Biscay, and if the numbers did not mean much to most of those who could overhear, Pearce was struggling with them, and not alone in doing so. The location was enough to dishearten anyone. That, along with the knowledge in the souls of the doubters that they might not be entirely accurate. The only bright spot was that HMS Grampus had been on course to weather Ushant on the Brittany coast, en route to the Lizard, and any ship heading home to England would sail the same line. There was some hope of being rescued. Dawes, who had transferred with some difficulty to the launch, leaving the cutter with 28 souls aboard, had called for an inventory of stores and water, and ensured the distribution was fair. He then fell into a discussion of the state of the weather and the way it might develop, the conclusion being that even if they were bobbing up and down through 10 feet of swell, it seemed clement for the time of year. The wind was stiff, but not severe, certainly not at present dangerous enough to make it imperative to head for the French shore. "It's getting dark," Dawes said finally, examining a glowering, cloud-filled sky that might threaten rain, but would certainly produce no moonlight. "We will raise sail on the launch and the pinnace, but we must each tie a cable with an oared boat overnight. In daylight they can keep pace rowing, but in the dark they will be in danger of becoming separated over several hours. At dawn we will spread out, but maintain sight of each other and look out for a ship, hopefully one heading towards home. But I will not trouble to be taken back south." Pearce looked in the gathering gloom towards the pinnace just ahead of them, containing the Barclays and Lutchens, as well as Devonogh and Gerson, this as the line was passed so they could progress in line ahead, the same arrangement taking place between the other two boats. "Heinrich, did you manage to rescue your instrument chest?" he called.
"I'm afraid not, John. I lost everything."
"A pity, my friend." It was no good cursing the fate that had seen him leave those papers with Lutyens for safety, and he reassured himself that he still had Hood's letter, so if he could get home he would get to see William Pitt. Something might be possible after all, and he could always write to Hood and asking for another copy. Not that he held out much hope there. Looking past Lutyens to Emily Barclay, he was half amused, half annoyed by the way she deliberately looked away. It seemed to him deeply ironic that here they were in a very steep tub indeed, and still she hung on to her foolish morality. Complete darkness came slowly, preceded by a long period of low, grey and diminishing light. Pearce organised those aboard to sleep or man the oars, the only object to keep the cutter on course, then issued a cup of water to each man, plus a ship's biscuit and a morsel of cheese. Thinking, as he compared that with which he started, set against that with which he was left, they best be picked up quick. Well wrapped up, he tried to sleep, which should have been easy now it was pitch dark. The only light was a small lantern on the top of the mast of the lead boat, and that was only there for a short while because it began to rain, the light being far enough off to be blotted out by the fall. Having issued instructions to drink as much of it as they could, and to gather more in anything they could, he rewrapped himself and fell into a fitful slumber. It was hard to have a whispered conversation in the pinnace, so crowded was it. Even harder for Cornelius Gerson, once he got to his captain on the opposite side to his wife, to persuade Ralph Barclay on the course of action, then to find a reason to get into the position he needed to carry out what had been agreed. Then he waited until sleep took over from concern. Unfamiliarity with ropes and knots — he had served on the lower deck, but was useless — meant it took him time to loose the cable, but eventually, without disturbing his sleeping companions in misfortune, he got it free and lowered it into the water. Chapter 16.
"It is my opinion,"
said Admiral Hotham in a voice loud enough to carry — he wanted to be overheard —
"that the attack is a waste of effort. The Bay of San Fiorenzo is too open to a northerly gale, and according to my reading of the charts, there is precious little deep water inshore, and plenty of rocks on which to rip out the bottoms of our ships should they drag their anchors."
The reply came from Mr. Holloway, the captain of HMS Britannia. No one else on the quarterdeck would have dared voice an opinion, and it was precarious for him. Like most flagship captains, he was not of vast seniority, admirals preferring to have running their ship a man they could easily overawe.
"Do the French not use it as an anchorage, sir?" "Only for the odd frigate, Mr. Holloway."
Hotham waved a lazy hand to where the French had scuttled the only ship stationed in the bay to avoid it being taken.
"Like the fellow whose topmast we can just see sticking out of the water. I have no knowledge that they have ever used it for a fleet anchorage."
Those in earshot, and there were many, were left to wonder at the truth of Hotham's remarks, given his relationship with the man who had ordered the attack was no secret. If Hood proposed, Hotham objected. Not that such opposition changed anything. It was also common knowledge that in the councils of the fleet he was generally ignored. It was therefore doubly galling that he had been given the task of carrying into the bay the troops necessary to take the town at its base. Hotham raised his telescope and ran it along the shore of Mortella Point. Dark green hills running down to broken-up grey rocks, full of stunted bushes where it met the sea, with only the very odd patch of beach. Those rocks, boulders really, strewn along the shore, were enough to indicate that the northernmost point of the island of Corsica was subject to violent storms, which produced waves big enough and powerful enough to break them up and toss what remained into the confusion of boulders they could now observe.
"That's a damned odd-looking tower, is it not?"
Hotham exclaimed, which had every other glass on the quarter-deck following the line of his own. Round, some 40 feet high, and near the shape of a crown roast of lamb, with its slightly wider crenellated top, it stood right on the shoreline and commanded the western entrance to the bay. On either side there was nothing but jumbled rocks, making any assault from the actual shore troublesome, though it was about to be attempted. This while the navy sought to subdue it from the sea. "A Genoese, sir, I believe, built when they had the island." Hotham dropped his telescope and looked at his flag captain, the bright blue eyes seeming to imply that being in possession of such knowledge was somehow unbecoming. "I bespoke a fellow in Leghorn, sir, when our destination was first mooted," Holloway replied quickly, making much effort to sound confident, in order not to be diminished in front of his own officers. "He told me of it, and seemed to think it would cause us trouble."
"A single tower?"
"Housing as its main armament the equivalent to a pair of our 18-pounders, sir."
"Hardly a match for our 32-pounders, do you think?"
Hotham, as he said that, looked around the faces of the assembled officers, his half-smile inviting, if not demanding, agreement. That such a gesture did not elevate Captain Holloway was inherent in the act, and it was not singular. The Admiral wanted everyone to know he was vastly more experienced than the younger man, to know that it was his judgment that mattered. The fact that it hit home was obvious by the stiff face Holloway adopted.
"I look forward to pounding it to dust, sir." "Which we must do, of course, before we can secure the bay."
No one reacted visibly to that piece of hypocrisy, Hotham having dismissed the tower as no threat in one breath, to then term it a hazard with the next. Admirals were like that.
"Let us get our bullocks ashore and see what Johnny Crapo has to oppose us. Signal Fortitude and Juno to proceed to their stations."
The lieutenant in charge of the flags had been standing by for this very order, so the various pennants were swiftly bent on and raised, a signal gun firing as soon as they broke out. Quite unnecessary, for on the deck of those two vessels, as well as the troop transports close by them, every eye had been on the flagship waiting for such a command. Indeed, many of the soldiers destined to land were already in the boats, gathered from every ship in the fleet, so that the first body of troops could set off immediately. Toby Burns was in one of those, leading a line of several more. He looked at the approaching shore, still some distance off, with trepidation. A beach of grey sand that looked dirty in the cold morning light, with the dark green hills rising behind it, hemmed in at both ends with a jumble of boulders and scrub which looked impassable. Once they were on that beach, they would advance or die. Not, to the midshipman, a very enticing prospect. Sat in the stern thwarts of Britannia's launch, he was facing the stony-faced bullocks who were under his charge, while his superior, Lieutenant Beddoes, no doubt to underline his personal bravery, was stood in the bows, 1 foot on the prow, as if he was prepared to take in his chest the very first volley of musket fire from the French defenders. The great boom of cannon fire broke the stillness of the morning as the warships designated to support the attack opened fire to subdue any shore-based batteries. The black balls flew over their heads to land in the trees which lined the rear of the beach, sending up great founts of sand, earth, wood, and foliage. In between the lines of boats loaded with bullocks were armed cutters, each with an 18-pounder cannon in the bow and a crew to work it. They began a cannonade too, their shot, lower in trajectory and being grape, designed to sweep out of the defence any human component, in the hope of driving them away so the soldiers could land unopposed. The counter-battery fire was not long in coming, the land-based guns firing from elevated batteries, both on the hillsides and the tower itself, and so able to project plunging fire. The sea around them was full of plumes of white water shooting up in the air. But one gunner got lucky and struck home just 2 lines to the left of where Toby Burns sat, crashing into another boat and causing it to fold like a piece of paper, bows and stern rising to meet each other as bloody bodies, Redcoats and rowers were thrown into the water, that accompanied by loud screams of pain and distress. His stomach already troubled, Toby Burns could feel it getting even more taut. He was vaguely aware that they were now in shallow water, pale instead of deep green, so clear was it, and it was not long before the keel of the boat ground into the soft underwater sand. Beddoes leapt forward immediately to land in no more than a few feet of water, just enough to cover his knees. As soon as his feet touched the bottom, the sea around him began to boil with spouts as a volley of grape shot was let loose by the French. Any balls that went into the sea, given the angle of fire, lost all velocity immediately, but one, which must have just skimmed the surface, hit his upper leg, and with a yelp Beddoes went down, the cry of anguish followed by a shout. "Mr. Burns, take charge and get these fellows onto dry land!" The youngster's mouth moved, but no sound emerged, and it was as well for him that the bullocks knew only too well that they, sitting with their backs to the shore, were prime targets. The man in charge, a sergeant of some years by the look of his greying locks, gave the order to disembark, and, as one, the troopers went over both sides of the boat, in a very disciplined fashion that showed the act had been carried out before, for it kept the boat steady. "Best look to the lieutenant!" cried one of the oarsmen, his gaze fixed on the still rigid midshipman. It was only when all eyes were on him that Toby was shamed enough to move, jumping over the side, aware that balls were still arriving in quantity, either hissing into the sea or cracking as they passed his ear, and wondering in his terror if his bowels would hold. The cold water he barely noticed, and he forced his way forward to where Beddoes was still on his knees, his trunk surrounded by blood. "You there! Get Mr. Beddoes back into the launch! We must get him to a surgeon!" "Your place is ashore, Mr. Burns." "Don't speak, sir," Toby gasped as he tried to lift his superior, glad when more hands came to help. "You must see if the soldiers need support with cannon, and take back some assessment of their progress." Toby wanted to shout at Beddoes that he was passing on the job he was supposed to undertake, the very one he had heard him volunteer them for, to tell him if he had not been so stupid and determined to show off, he would have been able to carry it out, and what right did he have to put forward someone else without so much as a by your leave? Now raised to his feet, although supported, the wound in his thigh was visible, bleeding but not pumping blood. Nothing vital had been hit. "Go, Mr. Burns. The men can tourniquet my injury." There was no choice. Loss of face, which would come with a refusal, was not an option. It was only as he surged forward he realized that along the beach men were landing, realized that with some already ashore and advancing on the line of low trees, the rate of musket fire and grape shot was diminishing. Out of the water, the sand on which he stood was firm, and his progress to those trees he could carry out at a run. He hid behind one as soon as he reached them. Toby Burns's chest was heaving, yet he knew it was not from much in the way of exertion, for the beach was not that deep nor the sand soft. Out of sight, he wondered what to do next. To follow the soldiers in the hill, now through the trees and out of sight, was one option. The other was to stay here. "You all right, lad?" The voice made him jump, and he looked around in alarm to see a red-coated officer, senior by his rank badges, in his hand a walking stick, looking down at him. "Just getting my breath, sir. I'm supposed to see how the attack progresses and report back about the need for support." "I think we have that already, boy," the redcoat said, pointing out into the bay. The 74-gun ship of the line, HMS Fortitude, accompanied by the frigate Juno, 32, had got into position and were in the process of using springs on their anchors to swing their sides round to bombard the tower. The gunners in the fortress had not waited. Already shot was peppering the sea around the warships. "Don't take much puff to walk, boy, even uphill. So why don't you come with me?" "Thank you, sir," Toby lied, falling in behind the bullock as he strode off, dashing slightly to get close so that the man's body would shield him from danger, vaguely noticing as he passed them the abandoned French positions, dead artillerymen and the odd dismounted cannon, though most, surrounded by various accoutrements, seemed to have been just abandoned. There was also a number of crumpled redcoats, and they passed some wounded going in the opposite direction, en route to attention.
"A poor lot we have fought this day, don't you know?"
The boy was thinking even a damn fool could get lucky. "The attack seems to have been a success, sir."
"It will be that, lad, when we have that tower."
The sound of a broadside filled the air, and looking out to sea, although they could not espy the ships, screened by the trees, they could see the billowing clouds of smoke rising into the air. Moving on, they were now passing mixed French and British wounded, mostly sat against trees, their heads lowered in despair. There was also the odd body, all in blue coats.
"Regular soldiers, boy,"
the redcoat exclaimed, before stopping suddenly and demanding of him,
"What is your damn name?"
"Burns, sir, midshipman." A tree suddenly splintered by Toby Burns's shoulder as a musket ball hit it, making him jump sideways and cry out in alarm. His redcoat merely turned and glared at the now visible outline of the tower, sure that was where the shot had come from.
"Damned impertinence!"
he cried, before looking back at Toby.
"Mustn't react, Mr. Burns. It only encourages them. Coolness under fire, young sir, an absolute prerequisite."
The only thing the youngster could think of was that the man who had fired was busy reloading for another attempt, so he was glad when his companions strode off in the direction from which that shot had come, and he was quick to get his body between himself and possible harm. Still trending uphill, they finally came to clear ground, and what had obviously been a defensive redoubt, to see French soldiers being taken prisoner. Another red-coated officer, seeing Toby's companion, rushed to meet them, stopping to raise his hat, his face alight with joy.
"We have the position, Colonel Moore. I have sent the men ahead to clear it right through, but I reckon the resistance to be broken."
"Their commander?"
"No sign of him, sir. He's taken to his heels and fallen back to the tower."
They were above the tower now, though still too far off for muskets, and so were presented with a clear sight of the whole bay and the battle going on between ship and shore, and it was far from clear to Toby Burns who was winning. The round shot was not denting those outer walls. If anything, it was bouncing off them to ricochet ineffectively into the surrounding rocks. Occasionally a huge cannonball would hit right on the face, and that would chip at the stonework, but it did not in any way look as if it was creating a breach. Stone flew, but no cracks appeared. Also obvious was the brazier sitting in the tower top, right by the two long cannon. They were firing red-hot shot, which could be deadly to wooden ships. The boy did not know the half of it, and had he been aboard either vessel he would have known the true meaning of terror. That red-hot shot had hit the hull of HMS Fortitude on half a dozen occasions, lodging in the scantlings to start fires which must be extinguished by cutting the balls out of the hull, a task that was full of risk to those employed. 3 of the ship's lower-deck 32-pounders had been dismounted, leaving 6 men killed and some 50 were already wounded, so that in the cockpit the ship's surgeon was hard at it with saw, his knives, and a needle and thread. Their fire was having practically no effect. The fortress being round meant the cannonballs could rarely strike with any consequence, and on a stationary vessel they were more at risk than the defenders. Broadside after broadside had ripped out to hit at those walls, some missing completely, for even anchored the ship was subject to the tide and the swell, while enough returned shot had missed the hulls to either hiss into the sea or slice through the rigging, setting that alight, so that the fire engine was in constant use. Toby Burns saw the springs let go, so that both frigate and ship of the line swung on their single anchors, thus reducing the size of the target they presented. Soon those same anchors were being plucked from the water, this as sails were sheeted home to take the ships out of range, Fortitude trailing smoke from smouldering wood as she did so. The bombardment had failed. Aboard Hotham's flagship, Captain Holloway was required to work hard to keep off his face a smirk, certainly as long as his admiral was in plain view.
"A poor showing," said Moore, "but damned brave."
"Quite, sir," the other officer replied, though the look on his face implied he disagreed. "I must report back to the shore, sir," Toby cried, "to say you have achieved your object." Colonel Moore let the tip of the walking-stick touch his gold-edged tricorn hat. "Then, young sir, you'd best be off. But tell whoever you are to report to, we overlook the tower. A pair of cannon up here, and we could make their lives warm." If the defenders on the tower at Mortella Point were cheered by their success, and thought themselves impervious to either ground assault or bombardment from the sea, they reckoned without the Royal Navy, or the ingenuity of Colonel John Moore. Toby Burns, given he knew the man in command and the route to the Redcoats' camp, was employed as a messenger, running back and forth, convinced that every bush and boulder hid a Frenchman. But through his officers a plan was hatched. Next day they saw a stream of boats coming inshore, as well as near to 100 sailors, to rig uprights and pulleys, onto which were winched cannons and their trunnions. Those brought in on a hatch cover lashed to empty barrels. More triangular stanchions were erected ashore, with yet more lines and blocks, this while a path was cut through the trees by the soldiers, the wood being taken up to where Colonel Moore was waiting. He had been examining the tower for some time, and a notion of how to subdue it had come to him. "It seems a great pity to me, gentlemen," he eventually said to the assembled officers, "to waste all this firewood. It will make a bonny fire, I think." All day the sailors toiled, roving and rigging, hauling and lifting, creating a run of lifting gear that raised those 2-ton lumps of metal up the steep hillsides until finally they were ready to be put into the emplacements the bullocks had made ready. Also brought ashore, requested by Colonel Moore to the mystification of his naval contemporaries, was the equipment to heat shot, the long-handled carrier that could be lifted onto the fire and held there until the cannonball glowed. Prior to heated shot, the range had been tried and established with round shot, but it was clear that, even plunging onto the fortress, the place was so sturdily built that little damage would be done, certainly not enough to entirely overcome defenders who could shelter inside. Any break in the bombardment brought them rushing out to fire cannon now elevated to the maximum, which posed great danger to the sailors manning the British cannon and the redcoats who were alongside them, though it also exposed them. It was seen a pair were not swift enough when the British fire recommenced, and they paid the price, being cut in half by a volley. "Heated shot, sir?" asked the officer commanding the party of sailors who had provided the men to both haul and work the guns, Lord Hood's nephew, also called Samuel, captain of HMS Juno. "Against stonework?" Colonel Moore smiled and handed over his telescope. "I bid you, sir, look upon the parapet of yonder tower, and tell me what you see."
End of CD 6. CD 7.
Sam Hood took the glass and did as he was asked, and it was clear that whatever it was Moore had in mind, it was not immediately obvious. "Our French friends," the colonel pointed out, "have lined the outer and inner parapet with a material called base junk, the object of which is to defray shot and stop stone from shattering, which would send debris flying in all directions, to the detriment of the men manning the guns. I believe, if I were to employ a naval expression, it would be a sort of gammoning, and it extends all the way down to the flooring." Sam Hood, still looking through the telescope, smiled. "Would I be right in thinking this base junk is flammable?" "It will not burn, sir, but it smokes like the devil." "Then I look forward to seeing the effect of your heated shot, sir." Normal round shot was employed to clear the fortress gunners, who were through the trapdoor before the first ball landed, this so they would not see the heated shot. Loading that was a tricky affair, a task for men who knew their game and not for the bullocks. 2 sailors, each with a pair of handles, carried the red-hot shot to the cannon, not delaying, for that would obviate the purpose, but with care, given they were surrounded by powder in cartridges and barrels, which had only to be touched by those cannonballs to blow the whole encampment to perdition. Loading had to be quick. Any false tipping and the ball would miss the cannon muzzle, and it needed solid oak, slow to fire, to drive the ball home, with both the men tasked to load the ball and the man tasked to drive it down to its furthest seat getting well clear immediately their work was done, lest the heat conduct to the powder and set the whole thing off prematurely. The man on the flintlock did not hesitate either. The gun had been pre-aimed, and he pulled the flintlock lanyard as soon as there was clear daylight before the muzzle. The first ball flew over the top of the tower, leading Colonel Moore to speculate on the scientific possibility that the nature of the ball, allied to the amount of powder used, was affected by the heat. Range dropped, the process was repeated again, this time the ball dropping into the top of that crown roast to roll until stopped by the parapet.
"A few more, I think," the Redcoat Colonel said. "Will do the trick."
And it did. Soon the whole top of the round tower was wreathed in smoke, and it was obvious that the colder air of the interior was drawing in through the trap-door that led to the next floor down, and in time, Moore had surmised, the whole building would be full of dense smoke, making it impossible for those inside to breathe. In the hope that his stratagem would work, the colonel had placed a company of his soldiers in the rocks leading to the base of the tower. The doorway, 20 feet in the air and unassailable even with ladders, was suddenly flung open, and smoke began to billow out, followed by coughing and spluttering Frenchmen. The signal that the notion had worked, sent to a ship, then passed on to those working the guns.
"I think we have our fortress, Captain Hood. You may tell Admiral Hotham that the upper reaches of the Bay of San Fiorenzo are his."
It wasn't over. There was a redoubt named Convention of 21 heavy cannon, which was easy to see held the key to the town, one that to assault over open ground would be murderous in casualties. Again the Navy did the impossible, transporting guns along paths meant for donkeys, sometimes wide enough for only one man, often with a drop of 500 feet to one side, never once losing a tar or equipment as they manhandled tons of metal along on ropes and pulleys, using the very rocks as stationary points to set up a battery that overlooked Convention from the one angle at which it was vulnerable. Once employed, they destroyed it in 2 hours. The whole anchorage and the tiny port was now in British hands. At a dinner to celebrate, Colonel John Moore, returning a toast from Sir William Hotham, named Captain Sam Hood and his men as heroes, and then he added that Midshipman Toby Burns had done sterling service as a runner, and, if the Admiral did not mind the temerity of a soldier suggesting a course of action to a sailor, the lad deserved a mention in whatever dispatch was sent back to London. Chapter 17. There was no way of knowing how much time had passed before the loss of the tow was discovered, only that the line which had attached them to the stern of the pinnace was slack enough to be hauled in. It looked as though the 2 men on the oars had, like John Pearce and every other soul in the boat, fallen into a troubled sleep, which not only allowed the cutter to drift, but also meant they had failed to turn the sand-glass and wake a relief. He also had cause to curse himself for failing to note the miscreants were a pair who had probably got into the spirit store. This established when dawn broke, and not only their bleary eyes told a tale, but their rank breath as well. Shouting proved pointless when, on the crest of several waves, no sign of a sail could be seen. Pearce felt even worse when presented with the end of a piece of rope, which showed no signs of fraying. If anyone could tie a secure knot, a sailor could, even the most useless sod. Yet he could not say what he suspected, that the knot might have been loosened, given the propensity of Jack Tar to see evil in any unexplained event. Sailors were the most credulous folk he had ever met in his life. Put the wrong foot on the ship first, and it was doomed. Any number of birds sighted promised perdition, so that sometimes it seemed there was a superstition for every waking hour, which on a ship at sea was 24. There had been mutterings too, he suspected, about Emily Barclay. Every ship in King George's Navy had women aboard, even where captains were strict about their presence, some even going to the length of disguising themselves as males. It would be the status of a woman like Mrs. Barclay that made her an object of nautical misgivings. Looking at the faces in the crowded boat, he surmised there were no natural navigators present. This allied to his own knowledge of his lack of ability in the subject. They were in the middle of the Bay of Biscay, and they might as well be in the middle of the moon. Nor did he have the instruments necessary to even try for a course that would take them home. There was, in short, no choice but to set the prow towards the point at which the sun had risen, albeit that was partly guesswork, given the dense overhead cloud. "Which would be where?" asked Michael O'Hagan quietly, his head lowered to make sure the question did not carry. Pearce, too, dropped his head. "The coast of France." "Holy Mother of God," Michael hissed. "Do you so love the place you cannot stay away?" "I have no choice. My sextant went down with the ship, and even if I had thought to fetch it, I'm not sure I can remember all I need to know about fixing a course by starlight, as Mr. McGann taught me." "Holy Christ, we need sight of that sainted man now. Are we not on the same line as he would sail to and from Gibraltar?" There was a brief flash of hope then. McGann's postal packet ran the route from England to the Straits on a regular basis. It was he who had taken John Pearce to the Mediterranean in the first place, carrying the letter to Lord Hood which had occasioned him being entrusted with the reply he now had in his coat pocket. When Michael called him sainted, he was not far wrong, for McGann was one of the kindest and wisest persons Pearce had ever met. That is, till you got him ashore and near a tankard of ale, from whence he became a burden. "Michael, we have been drifting all night. I have no idea where we are in line of longitude. All I could do is probably establish our latitude, which would not be much help if we're in the middle of the ocean with nothing but oars to propel us. We're not well supplied, and drifting in the hope of the sight of a sail could see us all expire. We must make for land, where there are heathens waiting to lop off our heads." "Saving your presence, Lieutenant. We would be obliged to be known what it is you and Paddy are a-whispering about." Pearce looked up into a sea of eyes, all on him, and they included Charlie and Rufus, though they at least were not full of suspicion. These men were part of the crew of HMS Grampus, on which he had been a supernumerary with no actual duties. They did not know him at all, and therefore had no loyalty to anything other than his rank, which would be tenuous in the extreme if they thought he had no idea of what he was doing. The bargain between officers and hands was simple. Bluecoats got respect because of their knowledge, and sometimes from the fear of their power in the article of punishment, but it was a covenant easy to rupture when neither were present. Odd that he should think of his father at that point, for here was the very notion over which they had disputed often, once Pearce Jr. had become old enough to form his own opinions. Adam Pearce maintained there was a basic good in people, not Christianity, in which he did not believe, but in their innate nature, the caveat being that a lack of the necessary means to exist in comfort, food, warmth, security, allied to a dearth of education, was what often rendered them little better than beasts. His son had disputed the contention, on the very good grounds that there were men of high education and full bellies, surrounded by servants to see to their every comfort, well warmed by blazing fires and devoted families, who behaved like ravenous monsters. Incarcerated in Fleet Prison, they had found it necessary to take turns in sleeping to avoid being robbed of all they possessed, which stripped the scales from young John's eyes, and his thinking had not altered with their subsequent flight. In the latter states of their gentle arguments, John Pearce was wont to point out to old Adam that being in Paris, in the midst of revolution going from euphoria to bedlam, they were surrounded by events which supported his argument. What did he face here? "We are crowded into an 18-foot cutter with supplies insufficient to keep us alive for very long. We have two choices, to drift around in the hope of rescue, or to head east for land."
"That being where?"
asked the man who had first spoken, his question producing nods in the others. Clearly they were happy to see him take on the role of spokesman. Pearce concentrated on him, searching his face to try to discern the kind of man he was. The nose was flat, as if it had been hit often and hard. The eyes were brown and small under heavy black brows, they topped by a flat forehead. Yet the look was not one of threat, more of inquiry. "France." Beside him, Pearce could feel Michael shifting sideways to get his right hand free, something that did not go unnoticed. Those small brown eyes flicked slightly, and the brows knitted a fraction, though it was impossible to tell if that was caused by the answer or the Irishman's movement. "Might I inquire as to your name?"
"My mates call me Polly, and I can't say the word France. Makes me happy."
That name, with the obvious hard look of the man, nearly made Pearce smile, but that would be, he knew, unwise. "Then, Polly, if I may be permitted to call you that, I have to tell you that I do not feel competent to suggest any other course."
"You not being a true lieutenant-like."
"You know." The positive reply was accompanied by nods from the rest of the tars.
"It'd be a habit to find out about folk, Mr. Pearce, and you being you, that weren't hard. It being special like that, you was the prankster of the fleet."
"Leghorn."
"And the ladies thereof."
"I'm curious to know if such a reputation flatters me or damns me."
"Neither one nor t'other. But what happens to us here might have a bearing on that."
"So if I ordered you to row east, I might not be obeyed?"
"Depends on if you was certain or not."
Why do I think I like this man? Pearce thought. There is no passion in his speech. He is not trying to guy or overbear me, just asking the questions that are in every one of his shipmates' minds. "If you know about me at all, it will not surprise you if I say I am not the man to navigate you to safety, and I am of the opinion, formed by standing on the deck of the ship and seeing nothing even on a busy route, that to hope to be picked up by a passing vessel is too risky to contemplate. I would therefore suggest, since I am in no position to command—" Pearce paused as Polly nodded. They both knew this cutter was a republic. "My view is the only safe course is to seek the nearest land."
"And I go with that," said Michael.
"As will your two mates, Paddy. But I doubt Mr. Pearce would mind if we stick in our halfpenny worth." "Not at all." Polly raised his voice. "Seems right to me, lads, but it is up to you to speak your piece if you dispute it." The murmuring was low, no man prepared to speak other than to his nearest neighbour. This while Pearce was fixed by those small and unblinking eyes. After half a minute, Polly spoke again. "Seems, as is common, none of you have a voice. So I say we go with what the officer suggests." Again no one spoke up, so Polly added another opinion. "Then we'd best get our backs into it, mates, and say thank Christ that the way the sea is running is in our favour." Aboard the pinnace there was certainly no republic. There might be a lieutenant and a midshipman aboard, but there was also Ralph Barclay, and for all his infirmity and being in constant pain, he was still a senior post-captain. With the cloud cover he decided on a direction of sailing by the location of the rising sun, as well as the northeast current, which was common to this area. A good enough course until the sky cleared, hopefully at night, where the North Star would help to guide them home. If he was in pain, it had no effect on his ability to command, and so ingrained were the habits of the service that no one, not even the most contentious lower-deck lawyer, of which there might well be a few aboard, was going to dispute with him, and that included the way he dealt with the loss of sight of the cutter, and the suggestion from the lieutenant that they should instigate a search. "It is unfortunate, I grant you, but we must trust to the competence of the people aboard to look to themselves." Seeing his inferior about to protest, he added sharp words. "Do you see Captain Dawes or any sign of the other boats?" "No, sir."
And what, pray, does that tell you?
Faced with no reply, it was easy to nail an end to any discussion, which he did with a firm tone.
It tells me, sir, that the amount of drift we have all suffered is substantial. It tells me that the cutter and the men aboard her could be miles distant. If we were safe on a ship with sharp eyes high on the masthead, your notion would be a good one. But we are not. We are able to see no further than the wave height allows us, and at some risk to ourselves. Therefore we are constrained by circumstances to look to our own needs.
Overheard by all aboard, it was easy to see it as a base appeal to their collective self-interest, so Ralph Barclay saw the need to give a nod to a more Christian notion, knowing he was on safe ground.
Your concern, Lieutenant, is commendable, and is, I am sure, shared by all of us in this boat, as is fear for our own safety. But I am no tyrant, sir. If the sentiment lies with what you say, I will abide by it.
Another voice spoke, that of a man on the oars. "Would we be allowed to ask what the odds are, Your Honour?" The speaker received a glare in response. No common seaman should address an officer so. Yet some allowance had to be made for circumstance.
"Fellow, if William Bligh can sail a boat over 4,500 miles to safety, I am sure I can get us all home and dry."
That cheered all he faced and got them nodding. He would not look sideways to his right where sat his wife. Then the man who had posed the question spoke again. "Thank you, Your Honour. Much obliged."
"Lieutenant, I wish to take that man's name, for I propose that a loss of discipline will not be to our benefit. The matter can be left till we reach England, but dealt with it must be. For now, I wish you to supervise the distribution of the rations. Then we must rearrange the way the boat is manned to get maximum advantage for our rate of sailing."
"Aye, aye, sir." "You know who is in that cutter, do you not, husband?" Emily asked, her lips close to his ear. His reply was made with his head down and quietly.
"It makes no odds, my dear. It could be the devil himself or my bosom companion. My thinking would not differ. You do not comprehend that we are in grave danger, being as we are in an overcrowded boat in a bad place. Biscay is home to many a violent storm, and I have to tell you, if we face one, we will not be likely to survive it, for we will be swamped. The wind is favourable and the sea benign for the time of year. We have a window of hope, but no more, so it is imperative that we take advantage of our good fortune." "Yet you did not tell everyone that." "It is our spirit as well as our luck which will get us to safety. Now I must ask you to leave me be."
Then he raised his voice.
"Lieutenant, some men on the larboard gunwales. Let us see what better rate of sailing we can achieve."
The orders that followed saw the sail hauled round to take more of the wind. The weight of bodies on the larboard side used to compensate the extra pressure, with the midshipman now sat with Ralph Barclay, doing what he was told on the tiller. When it came time to tack, the sail and bodies shifted, and if it was not fast sailing of the kind Ralph Barclay had experienced as a younger man, for being overcrowded the boat was low in the water, the increase in speed was obvious by the way the bows were now creating white spray every time they hit a wave. Rowing was hard work, requiring constant changes of oarsmen to prevent fatigue. But that same current which was aiding Ralph Barclay was even more kind to John Pearce. If he was less the experienced sailor than a man he saw as his enemy, he knew well the reputation of Biscay, for that same sainted Captain McGann had told him of its troublesome vagaries on their voyage south. He, too, knew that a storm would likely prove fatal, so the way the rowers were rotated had to be tempered by the need to achieve as much speed as possible. He was glad that those aboard had allowed him the authority to decide, though he worried, as the day wore on, that he had no certainty he was holding to a true course. He had set the prow to where the sun had risen to tinge the horizon, but that was a pretty nebulous thing to rely on, and while he might suspect the current ran towards the shore, he had no way of knowing, or any deep learning, to say if that was true. His darker thoughts were relieved by his taking his turn on an oar, an act which got him a nod from the fellow called Polly, who, it turned out, had the surname of Parrot, which was close enough to the bird, especially spoken, to explain why he was so named. Just as he was willing to share the burden of toil, he was also well able to take instruction from the men around him, who knew how to best employ their sticks in the rolling waves, gaining as much speed from crest to trough as they could, then fighting to maintain it as they rose to the next. Always careful to rest when all their oars could only make contact with was fresh air. One man, again they took turns, was tasked to stand in the prow and look out for any sign of a sail, in his hands 2 pieces of rope tied to the boat to make sure he did not go overboard if the cutter jibbed suddenly. But all every man employed saw was miles of deserted ocean. The winter day might be short, but it had enough hours to exhaust the entire complement, which presented Pearce with another dilemma. Should they seek to row on through the night, or rest? In the end it was a best guess to keep some men rowing, so the cutter had way enough not to be broached, but with the minimum effort, this as the others took turns to sleep. The sky began to break up overnight, which was a good thing, since the stars began to show, the mass of the Milky Way affording enough light to allow faces to be seen. But against that came an increase in wind, and from the wrong quarter, which Pearce suspected to be the north or northeast, which made rowing into it much harder, as well as altering the run on the surface water. That meant more men had to eschew sleep and row to keep way on the boat. He knew enough to be sure the current would be unaffected, just as he knew that what applied in terms of pressure to a deep-hulled ship did not apply to a cutter. Examining the sky, he tried, without feeling much in the way of success, to identify those objects Captain McGann had sought to teach him of, the 7 celestial bodies the older man had called shooting stars, by which he had been able to establish his position and plot a course. Failure to identify them all mattered little for what he required. All he needed was Polaris, to set the prow to what he was sure was due east. Way to the north, having made good progress throughout the daylight hours, Ralph Barclay welcomed that same clearing sky and the sight of that same North Star. His prow was set right towards it and the English Channel. A sip of water and a couple of ship's biscuits were not enough to provide sustenance for men working as hard as oarsmen. Yet it was all they had, and must be eked out. Nor was Pearce able to contemplate rest. If they tried to lie to, the wind, now strengthened, would drive them away from their hoped-for destination. And that was another source of worry. Revolutionary France was not a happy place for which to aim, and he knew that the coast where he hoped to make landfall was one of the most turbulent in that troubled country, even more so than Toulon. The Vendée region had been in revolt against Paris for nearly a year. Indeed, he had heard himself of some of the horrors committed by both sides when he was off La Rochelle the previous autumn. Was that revolt still alive? If it was, he and his companions might be lucky enough to land in territory controlled by the so-called Chouans, the local forces fighting the armies ordered to pacify the region. Or they might land amongst the revolutionary army, which would be dangerous in the extreme. The whole western part of France, from La Rochelle to Brittany, was reportedly soaked with the blood of the inhabitants, regardless of age or sex, as well as those sent to defeat them. The locals, led by priests and their landlords, fought with equal barbarity, showing no mercy to anyone they defeated and captured. Like all civil wars, it was ruthless, and pitted brother against brother, fathers against sons. They would need great good fortune, a thought which gained something from the rising of the sun, the orange ball turning to gold right ahead of them, and so seeming to offer a prospect of salvation. It gave more than that, for the night had been bitterly cold, so the little heat they received as it rose in the sky, evident even at this time of year, was welcome. Looking into the salt-encrusted faces and red-rimmed eyes of his companions, Pearce knew he would appear the same, knew that to blink brought on a sting, that to lick his lips was to be avoided, given it would only increase his thirst as he sucked in salt. And all around them was the rolling sea, nothing but that within sight as they crested each wave, no seabirds to hint at land nearby, which in turn produced gloom.
"A sail! I saw a sail!"
"Where away?" Pearce shouted, before admonishing the men who had turned to keep rowing as they fell off the top of the wave. Making his way forward through the mass of bodies was difficult, and he was aware that, having risen again, the lookout had not spotted what he believed he had seen previously. Was it no more than a vision caused by wishful thinking?
"There again! I see it, the top of a mast. No, two!"
John Pearce was with him now, his arms locked around the lookout's body to steady himself, his sore eyes straining forward, his heart beating with hope. Then he saw it as well, and he shouted back to confirm the sighting, to tell his rowers to pull like the devil, which he realized as soon as he spoke was the most unnecessary command he would ever issue. Closing with that vessel took several exhausting hours, though it was quickly identified as a two-masted brigantine of small displacement. The opinion was that whoever was aboard her was no sailor, given the top hamper was all a hoo. The square-rigged foremast had nothing but half a main course drawing, and that was clewed up at one end. It was also obvious the cutter was making more progress in closing than the sailing ship, which, given the favourable wind, was ridiculous. It took all of the morning and half the afternoon to get within hailing distance, which did not produce much in the way of joy, since John Pearce was told, in French, by a loud and angry individual who stayed out of sight, to stay away.
"Whoever had charge of this bark is no sailor, Mr. Pearce. She's a wallowing, not sailing."
Pearce nodded to Polly and hailed the ship again, which produced another negative response as well as a sort of argument. He suspected the men who were relying on him wondered what was being said in the shouted conversation being carried out in a language they could not understand. But he was in a poor position to enlighten them, given they were too low in the water to see onto the deck, even when the vessel was in a trough and they were on a crest. All he had to go by was that single, irate voice.
"I have asked them," he said eventually, "or whoever the person is doing the talking, to take us aboard, and he has refused."
"We's shipwrecked!" exclaimed one of the men on the oars.
"They's got to take us."
"They say they won't. We are to stay away."
"Then why," Polly demanded, "if they mean to leave us, don't they sheet home some sails proper and leave us behind? Even what they have made taut would be enough to show us a clean pair of heels."
Pearce cupped his hands and shouted again, his tone harsh instead of the supplicant way he had called before, which had Polly asking him what he had said.
"I said we are coming aboard whether they like it or not."
Chapter 18. Pearce fully expected, as the prow of the cutter was aimed at the scantlings, to find the side suddenly filled with armed men, which, given they had few weapons with which to effect a boarding, served to underline how desperate was their situation. Yet not a soul appeared, and the cutter clattered to the hull with little grace, the men of HMS Grampus, with the Pelicans at the fore, fatigued as they were, leaping for the bulwarks, rasping shouts coming from dry throats. What they saw on the deck stopped every man-jack of them stone dead, most before they had both feet on the planking. The priests and nuns, some 30 in number, knelt, heads bowed and hands clasped together around rosaries, obviously praying, the low murmuring sound of their devotions like the buzz of a hive. Michael O'Hagan immediately crossed himself, this while Pearce held up a hand to still the exclamations coming from the men he led. Slowly they climbed down onto the deck and stood in a confused huddle, not knowing what to do until Pearce spoke. "Michael, how do we address folk at prayer?" The shake of his friend's head left little choice but to advance towards the man leading the devotions. Not that he was sure it was leadership, only that he was in front and separate from the rest. Stopping before the priest, he took the time to look around a deck that was untidy in the extreme, with nothing shipshape. Loose ropes hung down from the masts, and bits of half-unfolded canvas lay here and there. Also, he thought he saw, in a stain in the unclean deck, a black, shapeless mark that could be blood. Never comfortable in the company of priests, Pearce was at a loss to know what to say. It was also true that those he had met and with whom he could hold a conversation were those of a more secular mien than this obviously devout fellow kneeling before him. Exchanges of a political nature with the likes of Talleyrand, the ex-bishop of Autun, or the Abbé Sieyès, both anti-clerical politicians in the salons of Paris, did not fit a man for a situation like this. "Monsieur l'Abbé?" One hand, palm open and facing him, came up, but the head stayed down, forcing him to turn and shrug, that before he realized that no one had moved, so he made frantic hand signals to tell them to search below, while also ensuring in a low voice that their cutter had been secured, a query that got him a look from men too long versed in their duties to have failed in such a task. Raising his head, he looked at the half-set sail, seeing it had been let go 2/3 of the way along the yard, but was still clewed up on the rest, while the lines to sheet it home were taut on the winged side and loose where it flapped. He was still standing waiting when whispered words informed him the ship was carrying no cargo. Though there were supplies of food, the holds were near empty, as was everything else, including the main cabin, though it looked as though that had been used as a place of rest. Michael tapped his shoulder as the kneeling priest, his voice rising a fraction, made a blessing with the hand he had used to silence Pearce. Then he finished his quiet prayer and looked up, showing a face full of sadness. "We have made our peace with God. You may do now as you wish." Replying in French, Pearce asked him what he meant, which engendered a certain amount of confusion until he added that they were Englishmen and explained the circumstances by which they had come to be here. It was quite amazing the way the priest's eyes could open so wide, and the gabbling explanation he passed on to his companions had them all raising their hands to heaven and loudly, almost ecstatically, praising the Lord. Then the leader stood and kissed John Pearce with some force on both cheeks. Some of the nuns were now in tears, wringing their hands and still thanking their Creator. "We were sure you were the apostates of Paris sent to cut our throats." "You must explain." It was incoherent to Pearce, and double Dutch to everyone else who had come on board with him, which may have been just as well, given it was such a bloody tale. They had fled from a monastery outside Nantes to escape the clutches of a ferocious Jacobin revolutionary representative called Jean-Baptiste Carrier and his assistants, taking refuge in the small estuary port of Saint-Nazaire, from where they had heard of the fate they had escaped. "He has overseen the murders of thousands of good people, some who died for their faith, others for their wealth and bloodline. But the beast Carrier reserved his bile most for the clergy and those who chose to be brides of Christ." It was a horrific tale of nuns raped and priests decapitated, of both being loaded into barges to which they were tied. They then sunk in the waters of the Loire River, the occupants drowning with prayers for salvation on their lips and the braying yells of the mob in their ears. Even more was what the abbé termed Republican marriages, overseen by the Jacobin representative in person, of priests and nuns, first made naked, then bound tight face to face, to be either run through with a single sword or to be thrown into the river to drown. "We were fortunate, monsieur, for the captain of this ship, a good son of Mother Church under Chouin, spirited us away before the beast could lay hands on us, though we saw our home, our abbey, burning as we fled. He got us aboard, but his crew refused to put to sea for fear of what would become of their loved ones left behind, for the Jacobins were on our heels, and they had no time to gather their families, leaving Captain de Frou with no choice but to ask us to aid him raise the anchor. Can you imagine it, monsieur? Priests and nuns on that thing they called the capstan. The tide was falling, and that took us out to sea. The crew took to the boats and went ashore." "And where is the captain now?" The priest looked at that black stain Pearce had noticed earlier and crossed himself. There was no need to say more about the fate of the man, but he did so nevertheless. He was no longer a young man, and he told me that what he was about to do he had not been required to try for many years. I confess I did not beg him to avoid the risk, but then he made light of it, and the fact that none of us could face the task of aiding him from fear of the fate he suffered. May God rest his soul. John Pearce could imagine that fate. Loosening a sail was a task for many hands, not one, a job that was coordinated, not carried out piecemeal, and a flapping, half-released main course would be a threat to whoever was on the yard trying singly to release it. It was also a place for men who were young, nimble, and fit. He fell when halfway along and smashed into the deck with the most frightening sound. I've heard a bone break, but not many at one time, and he was not a man of slender build, so I fear his bulk did him harm. We carried him to his cabin and prayed for him, but it was to no avail. John Pearce bit his tongue then. The man was dead, so no good would come of saying a little physical ministration might have had more effect than religious entreaty. Where did he plan to take you? Anywhere, monsieur, away from those Jacobin fiends. Pearce turned to Polly. Mr. Parrott, oblige me by getting some men aloft to loose the rest of that mainsail, while I instruct our divines on how to sheet it home. Polly raised an eyebrow at being addressed as Mr., but that was the least of his concerns. I'd be minded, and so would the lads, to hear this man's tale, as you have done. Later, let us get properly under way first, and second to that, let us calculate what stores are aboard. We will need to empty the sail locker and see what we have. Also, we will need someone nimble at the masthead. We are in French waters, and it would never do to be surprised. Polly nodded and shouted the requisite orders, then barked to see some of the men hesitate, for they were not topmen. Pearce turned back to the Abbé, who was eager to know what was happening. You have the good fortune, monsieur, to have had come aboard a party of the best sailors on God's earth. Now, I require you and your people to come with me while I show you which ropes to pull and when to pull them. To what purpose, my son? Why, to sail to safety, monsieur. And where will that be? England? The eyes opened in horror, and the voice was full of doom. Is that not a godless country? No, Monsieur l'Abbé. It is a country where you can practice your religion without fear for your life. Pearce took his arm and led him to where the falls hung loose from the rigging. Now gather your charges and get them clasping hard on this rope, as if it would haul down to them salvation when I say to pull. Ralph Barclay had got the lieutenant to make a knotted and weighted line by which they could make a rough calculation of their speed while he used a sand-glass brought aboard to time their tacking and wearing. Not dead reckoning, but enough of a measure to keep them on a reasonable course, though he tended to lay longer to larboard than starboard, with the knowledge that somewhere close by lay the iron shore of Brittany. Their course might raise one of the Norman Isles, but he hoped to weather both Ushant, avoid them, and make a landfall east of the Isles of Scilly, which would bring him to the shores of Cornwall or Devon. They might be under sail, but the work was having an effect on those aboard, for the eking out of the supplies meant they received little sustenance and less water, which left him with two conflicting hopes, cloud cover and rainfall, or clear skies that at night made navigation easy with that bright pole star, 1 degree off true north, to guide him home. Having steered by it throughout the night, all in all he was feeling fairly confident, certainly enough to allow himself to surrender charge of the boat and get some sleep at sunrise. That confidence faded when he awoke, and it was pointed out to him that the sky to the west was showing signs of increasingly heavy cloud. He did not need to be told the wind had swung yet again, nor what that increasing cloud portended, and it was not a happy thought that made the notion of that iron shore take on more meaning. If the wind came in at a gale force from the west, which looked to be likely, it would be that much harder, In fact, it might be impossible to keep clear of it, even in a single-sailed fore-and-aft-rigged vessel. In a time of peace, and seeing what was bubbling up on the horizon, Ralph Barclay would have immediately run for land, and it was something he had to consider now, unpalatable as it was. Captivity might be unpleasant, but it was preferable to death, for sitting as low as she was with overcrowding, it would not take much of a cross-sea to swamp them. The real question was how long he had to decide, given he was on a part of the ocean notorious for tempests. That Brittany shore, full of broken rocks, deep bays and high cliffs, was testimony to the force they could generate. "Husband, I require to relieve my bowels." Damn the woman, he thought. Why could she not be like everyone else aboard and just void herself without having all aboard avert their gaze, and behind a screen at that? Impolite it might be, but they were in a dire situation where manners mattered little. Emily was thinking she had seen enough of the men aboard, perched on the gunwales with their ducks around their ankles, or pissing into a bailing can before tossing the contents over the side, to last her a lifetime. She was also acutely aware of the approach of an awkward time of month, and what needed to be done so she could avoid staining her clothing. "One day I must introduce you to Portsmouth Cath," Ralph Barclay said maliciously. "If you saw her antics, you might be less worried about the eyes of the men upon you. She is wont to challenge your mids to a pissing contest, and even with her sex she can outgun them every time, taking their bets as reward." "Spare me your anecdotes of the graceless whores of naval ports." "All I'm trying to say to you, Mrs. Barclay, is that these men before you have seen everything, and while you might suffer from embarrassment, they are more likely to react to the sight of you going about your occasions with indifference." "I have learned much about life since I sailed with you, husband, but that I would like to be spared." "Then you will oblige me by waiting until we have established our latitude. Lieutenant, have your sextant at the ready. By the sight of the sun, we're approaching the zenith." Having held on as long as she could, it was with some discomfort that Emily Barclay waited through the ritual of shooting the noonday sun, which not only gave them a time by which to set the sandglass, but, by establishing the height of the orb relative to the horizon, a fairly accurate fix on where they were and how far they had yet to travel. And all the while she squirmed, her husband was looking to the west with a wary eye. Whatever else Ralph Barclay was, and opinions differed, he was a good seaman. He had been at sea since his 13th year, and if he had endured some awful maltreatment, he had also been taught his trade in waters that ran from where they were now to the other side of the ocean. Each time they rose on a wave, he saw that cloud thickening, but it was the darkening at the base which told him it portended real trouble. "Devereux, the canvas screen for Mrs. Barclay, and you men avert your eyes." With that he went forward, handed from man to man, to consult with the lieutenant. Emily was left glaring at Gerson, who had on more than one occasion sought to peep round the screen Devereux held to get a look at her with her skirts raised. He was nothing but a slug, and that was underlined by the smile he gave her in response, which made her blush, and made her furious for doing so. "A little further round, Devereux, if you please," she asked, cutting off his eyeline. "Don't forget to hold on tight, Mrs. Barclay," Gerson said, a smirk on his face as it was cut out. "It would never do to have to let fly the sail to fetch you out of the sea." "If I were you, sir, and I had charge, you could stay to drown." The voice that replied had no humour in it at all. "People have tried to drown me afore, and by damn they have failed." "Mind your blaspheming, Gerson," said Devereux. "This be Captain Barclay's wife, and not some common cull." Raising herself gently, Emily went about her business, careful to keep a good grip. It was the sound of a distant gun that nearly did for her, because the hand on the tiller, that of the midshipman, jerked slightly, and given the wind was reduced on the sail, so did the boat. Forced to wrench forward, she fell back into the boat, still in a state of dishabille. Devereux, just as taken by the sound as everyone else, had dropped the canvas screen, leaving her exposed and very red in the face. This as her husband shouted, "A signal gun, by damn, or I'm a Dutchman's uncle!" For all her blushes, no one was looking in Emily's direction, every eye being cast forward, which allowed her to rearrange her clothing. Then, and only then, did she realize the import of what was being said.
"We are somewhere off the Pointe du Raz, lads, and if that is a signal gun, then it will be the inshore squadron blockading Brest."
"It might be the Frenchies, Your Honour," a voice cried.
"Take that damn man's name!"
They sighted the first of the sails mid-afternoon, and atop that a long white pennant streaming forward to denote the rank of a commanding admiral. Odd, given his nickname, if Ralph Barclay had the right of it, would be Black Dick Howe. Soon the three masts of the frigate were plainly visible, and they obviously had sharp eyes at the masthead, for almost as soon as they could make out the top strakes of her hull, the sails were trimmed to bring her round to close, which produced a hoarse cheer.
"Belay that!"
Ralph Barclay called, but without much rancour.
"Let them see we are true Englishmen. Hearing a cheer like that, they might mistake us for Johnny Crapo."
"HMS Nymph, if I'm not mistaken, sir," the lieutenant called joyfully. "One of the finest frigates in the fleet."
"By damn, sir, she could be the tub of Hades Hall for all I care."
That was when he caught the eye of his wife, who was frowning at his language. The calls of recognition were exchanged as the frigate closed, changing course to present a lee side, with the midshipman on the tiller bringing the boat round, sweet as you like, to lay alongside, with willing hands to help them. They came aboard a vessel as full of joy to see them as they were to be safe on a deck. But there was no time for pleasantries, for as the captain, Edward Pellew, pointed out, there was a blow coming, and he needed to get his ship into a fit state to confound it. "In short, Captain Barclay, I must get some sea-room, so please go to my cabin, where my steward will make you right at home."
"You have a surgeon aboard, sir?"
"I have."
"Then I would be obliged if he too would come to your cabin and bring with him some tincture of laudanum."
John Pearce would have admitted without a moment's complaint that he was far less a seaman than Ralph Barclay, but he had served long enough at sea to know trouble when he saw it. The darkening horizon, along with the strengthening wind which had swung right round to the southwest, had him in the captain's cabin studying the charts and looking for a place to shelter. He had been in a Biscay blow the previous year, and the master of the vessel on which they had been sailing had got them into a safe haven. Now, without an ounce of that man's knowledge, he had to do the same. At first sight there were any number of places, but the most obvious two were Belle Isle, to stay in the lee of that large island, or to make for the great hook which formed the outer protection of Quiberon Bay. Not trusting to his navigation, he might miss even a large island, he opted for Quiberon, putting up the helm of a vessel he now knew to be called Guiscard, and sailing due north to get a sight of land. The cry from the masthead had him on deck in an instant, and the news that there was a sail bearing due east took him up into the rigging, having grabbed one of the late captain's telescopes to have a look. The red, white, and blue flag streaming from the masthead told him the nationality of the vessel, while the fact of it coming out from the mouth of the Loire, albeit that river was way over the horizon, suggested it might be a warship hunting for the very vessel he was on. Or it might be another merchantman. It was too far off to tell. He could not take a chance. He was on an unarmed ship, and had a crew practically devoid of weapons, barring a few cutlasses they had found in a rack. If it was an enemy warship, he had no means of fighting them, and that meant surrender. Not a pleasant option, given what he had been told about the activities of the Vendée Jacobins. If they were after the priests and nuns, they would likely mete out to him and the others the same treatment used on them. Sliding down a backstay, he gave the orders to alter course. If there was a blow coming, they must head right into it, drawing on the pursuit, if it was that, in the hope that they, reckoning the game not worth the candle, would bear up for home. "We'd best fetch out some storm canvas," were the first words he uttered. "And somebody go and find that abbé. Tell him we need his prayers." Chapter 19. It was a common expression among sailors that the weather was a fickle beast, and one wont to surprise a fellow rather than do as he anticipated. Those clouds, building on the horizon, and the system they portended, performed exactly to that maxim. The men had got the heavy storm canvas on deck, and were bending most of it onto a topmast spar, not easy given their numbers and state of well-being, while another was being fetched up for the lateen sail of the mizzen, when the wind shifted once more, this time into the southeast, which meant the heavy, thunderous threat ahead seemed to stay where it lay, neither closing in on them nor receding. They had already been aloft, Pearce included, to get set as much sail as the brigantine Guiscard would carry, with the man in command racking his brain to recall everything he'd ever been told about the task being performed, adding as much guesswork as knowledge, this while one of the crew who knew the duty cast the log to tell him if they were gaining any speed. At first they did, but it soon became apparent that the more sail they set, the less they gained, and Pearce had some taken in on the foremast, reckoning on something he had been told, that the head of the ship could be driven too hard into the sea with an excess of canvas aloft, slowing the rate of sailing.
"Happen the father's prayers are working," said Michael, seeing the weather still far off.
This said with all the conviction of his religion.
"I would be inclined to agree with you if that fellow over our stern were not gaining on us."
Taking a telescope once more, Pearce went back up the shrouds all the way to the mainmast top, there to hook a leg over the yard and settle himself so he could employ the thing. Time had taught him to use it properly. Small movements of the tip were magnified, as much as was the observable object, so he quickly had the pursuit in plain view, and the first thing he noticed, without in any way being sure of how to designate it in terms of a name, was that it was a three-masted warship, the deck carrying what were unmistakably cannon. Keeping it in view, not easy as he swayed in an arc caused by the ploughing motion of the ship, he tried to work out a way to confound a vessel that was armed against that on which he sat, which was not. Foul weather had been his only potential ally, and an uncertain one at that. But to spin round and look over that dipping prow was to see that as a threat distant still. Nor could he really do what he'd been told warships did in a stern case, lighten the ship. She carried no guns, no cargo, only bodies. Other questions intruded. Would the chase be satisfied with the ship? If he took to the cutter again, not a happy prospect, given it had been overcrowded when he came upon the Guiscard and would be a damn sight more so with double the number aboard, would these pursuers let them go? Or were they after clerical blood to add to that already spilt? If they were, he and his men would not likely be spared a similar fate. Nightfall might aid them, if they could stay far enough ahead, changing course as soon as darkness fell. Yet the sky above was now a mixture of fluffy white clouds and clear sky that promised, if it stayed the same, long periods of starlight. With a waxing moon, that was damn near as good as daylight on the reflective ocean. Being an optimist by nature, John Pearce was not yet in despair, but rack his brain as he might, he could see no way out of the dilemma. On the principle that several brains were better than one, he decided to put it to the men.
"If it be the holy mollies they're after, let's put them in the cutter with the oars, I say."
He had gathered the men he now led near the wheel, so that Charlie and Rufus, manning it, could be included, and he was pleased to see they looked shocked. Few on the now steeply canted deck nodded heartily at that suggestion, though it made many of them look thoughtful, while Michael O'Hagan wore an expression that indicated he wanted to clout the culprit. Much as it was distasteful, there was no denying it was a possible solution.
"No," said Pearce, "that is a course I cannot countenance."
"It's up to you, mate," replied Weary, the man who had made the suggestion. The strangled cry, as Michael picked him up by his shirt and lifted him 4 feet off the deck, turned into a choking sound.
"Sir, not mate, you heathen."
"Put him down, Michael."
"Sure, I'd rather drop him over the side. Happen those chasing us will stop to pick him up and gain us time."
"Can't blame him, Paddy." Michael looked at Polly Parrott with a frown.
"My given name is Michael, friend, and I'd be obliged if you would use it."
"The name don't make no odds.
We're in a pickle here, without there being a clear way out. Mr. Pearce here has told us what those Jacobin buggers got up to, and while I ain't no blind foe of a papist, I'm no more minded to suffer as they are promised."
Pearce looked up at the sky, and the way the sun, now hidden by a cloud, was well past its zenith, and beginning to sink in the west, speaking his previous thought, trying to sound what he was not, confident. "If we maintain our present rate of sailing, he will not come up on us before night falls. We will change course and see if we can confound the fellow."
"And if we don't?" Parrott asked.
"Let's see what dawn brings, Polly. Meanwhile, I will see if we can get the nuns to make us some dinner." The sailors had to fetch the wood from the store, as well as the barrels of salt beef from the hold, this while others got the coppers lit. For once they could have as much as they liked, peas and hard cheese included. There was no biscuit, but what they had brought aboard, and that had to be shared with the clerics, but not before they had said grace in the Latin, which had some of the Jack Tars fearing for their souls, having been raised all their lives to see Catholic priests as the servants of Old Nick. There was cider instead of beer to drink, which occasioned the odd moan, so wedded were they to their small beer, and, knowing the strength of that brew, Pearce put Michael in charge of its distribution, and the storeroom where the barrels were kept. The last thing he needed was any of the few men he had getting drunk, which they would do readily if deep despondency took over from their limited hopes. He needed them alert. Having eaten with them, drinking little, Pearce went aloft again to be alone with his thoughts, well aware that the discussion would continue without him, and out of earshot of the likes of Michael. If they collectively decided they wanted to abandon those priests and nuns, he was in no position to stop them. Certainly they would not respect his rank, which made him smile given he had little of that commodity himself for his commission. Instead of dwelling on it, he trained the telescope once more to view a deck much more clearly defined now by the lower sun, so much so that he could see the figures moving about on it, as well as the men on the wheel. The figure that took his eye most, hanging onto one of the foremast shrouds and staring straight ahead, made him catch his breath. He was dressed all in black, from his tall hat, kept on his head by a scarf, through his coat all the way down to his breeches and high boots, the only flash of colour, the heavy tricolour sash he wore around his waist. He was too far off to be certain, but that sinking sun was throwing a bright light from behind Pearce onto the enemy deck, and before it faded, he had made out the face of a man who would most certainly kill him, and take pleasure in doing it slowly if he caught him. The one-time representative on mission from the Committee of Public Safety, Henri Raffin. The last sight he recalled of him was the bastard floundering in the water off La Rochelle, he having chucked him into the sea, following on from a nip-and-tuck rescue in which he had been taken hostage. A man of outstanding arrogance, he was just the kind of turd that had floated to the surface thanks to the Revolution. And if what he had heard of events in Nantes were true, he was, too, a perfect tool for vengeful pacification, a fellow who took pleasure in seeing others die, gloated in hearing the crowd bay as the blade of Madame Guillotine chopped off the heads of those whose only crime was descent, or having been born into the better classes. Whatever his doubts before, whatever the conundrum, there was no way in creation he was going to give himself up into the hands of that man, and if there was no other way to avoid being taken, he would steer the ship straight for Raffin and seek to take the bugger to the bottom with him, a notion which set his mind working long before he made his way back to the deck. Night came slowly, as always in these climes, but not before they had experienced a glorious sunset, the heavy horizon clouds having broken up, the kind of golden light fading through orange to red which would have been inspiring for a less troubled soul, especially as it was accompanied by sweet singing from 'tween decks, where the holy passengers were celebrating Mass. As soon as they were under cloud and in the dark, Pearce, having noted the position of Polaris before the star was blotted out, altered course to the north. If he was going to try to run, that was the best direction, with the wind coming in nicely over the starboard quarter. It was also the way home. He had only held his previous course, sacrificing a certain amount of speed to allow for this change, working on the principle that whoever commanded the chase, and it certainly was not Henri Raffin, would not know the Guiscard was manned by British sailors. He might, therefore, given a change of course had to be on the cards, suppose they would aim for a return to French soil. If they reversed their course, while he held his new one, the gap might be opened enough to get them hull down and therefore hard to spot, even under a bright moon. He was on the wheel himself now, calling for braces to be tightened, trying to feel through the spokes the best point of sailing and damn the course. His hopes dashed when the sky cleared and shafts of moonlight bathed the seascape, to show that if they had made ground on their pursuers, they had held steadily to their original line, which was not enough to put them out of sight. This proved by an immediate change of course and a renewed chase. "What now, Mr. Pearce?" asked a voice in the pale light. It was telling that he did not answer. There was nothing really to say. The same condition having prevailed throughout the hours of darkness, there was a clear sense of foreboding when the sky began to lighten to the east, showing the chase to be no more than a couple of cables' lengths off their stern, so close that no telescope was needed now to see, when full daylight came, the details of the Frenchmen. Soon they would be employing their bow chasers, seeking to knock away something vital and bring matters to an even quicker conclusion than was inevitable.
End of CD 7. CD 8.
"Gather round, all of you!" shouted Pearce, still manning the wheel. He waited till that request was obeyed, wondering about the words he would use to explain the thoughts he had formed aloft. "Before we departed Toulon, my companions and I were on a fire-ship, and you know, having had to abandon your own vessel, how dangerous that is." "You planning to see us burned off a barkie a second time, Mr. Pearce?" Somehow Polly managed to say that without making it sound like an objection, which Pearce had been expecting, raising again his feeling of respect for the man. He was a natural leader. If he had decided to dispute his authority, the men, pelicans aside, would have backed him, and it was plain he knew it. Yet he had not done so, nor, without any better suggestion to make, had he even set out to diminish the man to whom he had deferred. "If we load the cutter with what she will bear in the article of stores, how long before we can get her back in the water, all hands on the task?" "If we get her set right, minutes. That's all you will have, and that includes getting the bodies aboard as well." "The Papists?" asked Weary, who had wanted to leave them behind. This time he'd made sure he was not within reach of Michael O'Hagan. When Pearce nodded, he insisted, "They'll sink us." "No, we'll float, not in comfort, but the other thing we must do is step a mast on her. There are carpenter's tools below, and we have spars which will serve. I am trusting there is one of you who can rig the tackle for a sail, and we do not lack canvas. That means we do not need room to row, so there is more room for people." "And then you're going to set this barkie alight?" Polly asked. "And ram her into the chase. If she's fired, I doubt they will have much stomach to pursue us. They'll be too busy saving themselves." "You're mad," Weary said. "If anyone has a better idea—" The sound of the ball being fired arrived not long before the object itself, and looking aft, Pearce saw the smoke being blown in their direction, thinking that even the wind was aiding them. The ball dropped short of the stern, but not by much. "An extra charge of powder will see the next one strike the hull. Time to decide." "Ben," said Polly, "you're handy with rope work. Sort out what we need for a sail, while I get the right kind of spars for a mast and a gaff. Weary," he continued, "get them tools out, and what you need to rig not only a mast, but places on the cutter for stays to hold it steady. The rest of you, get that cutter turned over and the stores set by it that we need. More drink than food." He looked and nodded at Pearce, who then issued his own commands. "Michael, Charlie, Rufus, I want anything flammable you can find placed right under the forward companionway, as well as the means to get it ablaze." The crash of gunfire was louder now as both bow chasers fired together. Pearce had predicted the powder charge would be increased, so the sound of tearing timber accompanying the arrival of the two cannonballs added to his standing. "Michael, get the priests and nuns to help you. They will be safer further away from the stern and, if they're working, less inclined to panic." The chase crept closer over the next hour, firing steadily, reducing what had been the captain's cabin to a mess of glass and matchwood. Pearce was more concerned about the point at which the range decreased enough to allow those cannonballs to carry the taffrail. Then he and everyone on deck would be at risk. Added to that, he dare not wait until they were within range to hit a mast, given he needed all the sails he had to manoeuvre. Ahead of him the deck was alive with men working, some bringing stores up from below, while the pelicans were working out of sight. All was being done that could be for what was a desperate throw. It was Polly, straightening his back from his labours, who froze, looking over the bowsprit. He waited for a moment before shouting, "Ship over the bow, dead ahead! Oh, Christ knows what it is! Polly, take the wheel!" Pearce raced aloft, glass tucked in his waistband once more, to sit on the cross-trees and aim at forward. What he saw was a ship all right, but nothing like one he had ever seen before. It had a decent hull, but stumps instead of masts, and the most god-awful rig of sails in creation. Yet at the top of the fore-stump flew a red pennant, indicating even to Pearce that it was under the command of a Vice-Admiral of the Red Squadron, and that told him the vessel was British. It was also the case that it was coming round to close, for Polly had seen the stern, while he could see it broadside on. Even at a distance, and taking into account his inexperience, he had never seen the like, so sluggish and ungainly was the manoeuvre. That was when the taffrail was reduced to splinters, and Pearce, looking down then, knew the next salvo, as carefully aimed as all the others had been, would come over that mess of timber and sweep along the deck. Yet there before him was a British warship, a strange bugger for sure, but armed. What to do? How quick were they closing? "On deck there! Get below! Polly, lash off the wheel and do likewise, and don't one of you dare dispute with me. That is a direct order." "I will hold my place, Mr. Pearce," Parrott replied, as everyone else rushed to obey. "I got a bit of poop to mind my back." Pearce had his glass back on the chase, this time on the topmast. Did they have a man up there as a lookout? Had they seen what they were sailing towards, and would they up their helm when they did? His answer came as the chase yawed round to present a broadside, every gun on its larboard deck, some 7 in all, firing off as it bore, the balls smashing into the ship and taking lumps out of her bulwarks. If they hit anything vital, main, mizzen, or wheel, maybe an important yard hard enough to dislodge a sail, they would take the ship, and it was no consolation being in possession of such knowledge when you could do nothing to prevent it. Yet some hope lay ahead, for the distance between that strange warship and Guiscard was now closing fast. The chase had resumed its course, loading the bow chasers during that yaw, so they spoke immediately. Pearce watched in fascination as the black balls arced through the air to land on the deck, one skipping by the foot of the mainmast to ram into the bulwarks, where it began to roll around. He had to just sit there, reckoning that another broadside was coming, and it would be more dangerous than the last, for he was as safe up here as he was on the deck. That was until he recalled the lascar they had buried from the deck of HMS Grampus, causing that feeling to evaporate. The sound of more gunfire was not accompanied by smoke from the bow chasers, so he turned to see 2 great plumes of water at a cable's length from the bowsprit. Who was the fellow aiming at? Pearce had no idea of the nationality of either ship before him, leaving him with the horrible possibility that he might be caught between 2 fires before anything was resolved. Then it occurred to him. The chase had no idea if the ship ahead was an enemy or a friend. The pennant he had recognized was a stranger to them. Time, if you discounted the now regular boom of those bow chases and the more occasional broadside, stood still as the three ships closed into an increasingly confined part of the ocean. Holly had used his brain and got everyone in the bows waving frantically to the ship ahead, which was all they could do in the absence of a flag, and it seemed to have some effect, because when she fired her bow chasers again, the shot was aimed well clear, clearly a warning to the chase. Now so close he could see that there was a furious argument taking place on the quarterdeck, and it was the unmistakable sight of Raffin waving his arms that told him he was disputing with the captain about what to do. That the man in command won was obvious. Pearce could see the hands on that pursuing deck lashing off their guns and rushing to the falls. Within minutes the sails had been let fly, the wheel was being spun, and the bowsprit was spinning away. Ahead, the captain of that warship had altered course to give him a clear shot of a ship flying a French revolutionary pennant, and now it was his turn to yaw, albeit like a soaked log, and deliver a broadside. The frigate, for Pearce now recognized the hull as such, let fly with everything she had, and given they were bigger cannon and their range was greater, the slowly turning chase found itself surrounded by a mass of boiling sea-water. If anything was enough to redouble their efforts, then that broadside was it. Soon they were round, showing her stern lights. The sails were sheeted home again with the yards braced right round, as they needed to be to sail into the wind. The shout came through a speaking trumpet, which obscured the face of the man doing the asking, a blue coat surrounded by many others, as well as a number in red.
"Ahoy there! Who are you?"
For the first time in his life the reply, delivered through cupped hands, was one he was happy to give.
"Lieutenant Pearce of His Britannic Majesty's Navy, in command of the French vessel Guiscard. You have charge of a strange vessel, sir. Is she a prize?"
This thought had not occurred to Pearce, and it was a pleasing one.
"I have the makings of a strange tale, sir, which I will happily relate to you if I may come aboard." "By all means do so."
"Might I also ask your name, sir?"
"Captain John Warren of HMS Fury." "Let's get that cutter in the water, lads."
There was also pleasure in hearing the man called Weary reply, "Aye, aye, sir." 20 minutes later Pearce was on the deck of HMS Fury, with its stumps in place of proper masts, shaking the hand of the captain and being introduced to his officers. That was followed by a salute to a Major General Sir David Rose, returning to England from having commanded the troops of the East India Company fighting the French around Pondicherry. The general, a rosy-cheeked, square-faced fellow, in contrast to the nut-brown naval officers, listened with interest to John Pearce's tale, and added, before Warren could comment,
"Damn it, that demands a toast, if not several. The first to your surviving an inferno, the second to your timely finding of a ship, and the third to such an amazing rescue."
Looking into that face, somewhat too close in colour to his red coat, with the mischievous blue eyes and the smiling slight overbite, Pearce wondered if the sentiment was celebratory or prompted by a love of the mere idea of a drink. It mattered not. He was in the mood to partake himself, and just as happy, tankard in hand, to hear the fate of HMS Fury, a ship that had departed Lisbon days before HMS Grampus. She had run into the storm of which they had seen evidence, losing first her foremast, then her main and mizzen, each having to be cut free with men still clinging to them, for fear they would drag down the ship. That lascar they had buried was one, as were many of the crew, Fury having been in the East for several years.
"We were promised a refit by the company in their Calcutta dockyard, but delay followed delay, and we were ordered home before it could be carried out." "Slack folk, the company wallers,"
said General Rose. Then, seeing Pearce inquire, he explained it as an Indian expression.
"More port, Mr. Pearce."
"Thank you, no, sir, I've had enough."
"Nonsense!"
he barked, filling the tankards of himself and the others without recourse to any servants.
"Don't do a man good to stint himself. Best thing in the world to keep the quacks at bay, what?"
"You have no idea what service in the East does to men and ships," said Warren, leaving Pearce to wonder, by his expression, if he was including the general. "But our timbers were worse than anything old Granny had to bear, and the seating on our masts, well, I reckon that poor man you had to bury tells you all you need to know." "It does occur to me, Captain Warren, that but for that hurricane and the damage you sustained, you would not have been so slowed in your voyage as to be able to rescue us."
"By damn!" boomed Rose. "This young fellow has the right of the matter. It's an ill wind which does no man any good."
The decanter was in his hand again, and Pearce's tankard was filled to the brim before he could say a word, as were all the others, the general standing for the toast, which forced them all to do likewise before emptying their drinking vessels.
"To an ill wind!"
Chapter 20. It was ironic that Captain Dawes and his party were the first to put their feet on English soil. Captain Edward Pellew and HMS Nymph, along with their consorts of the inshore squadron, pleased at the turn the weather had taken, were required to resume their station off the Pointe du Raz to cover the approaches to the port of Brest, the main station of the French Atlantic Fleet. Ralph Barclay was obliged to wait 10 days, gnawing and irascible at the delay, waiting until the sloop carrying dispatches came from Pellew's commander, Admiral Lord Howe. That returned, carrying the squadron's logs as well as any intelligence to Torbay, where Howe's capital ships were anchored, ready to sail, given notice to do that for which their deployment was designed, to meet the French in the Channel and dominate that vital and strategic stretch of water. Ralph Barclay, along with Gerson and Devereux, was thus faced with an uncomfortable 2-day journey from the West Country to London in a coach, which he swore was without a single working spring. Thankfully, he had secured enough laudanum to dull his constant pain. Emily Barclay went straight back to Frome, a much shorter journey, ostensibly to prepare for his homecoming, in reality to be apart from the strain of being in his company. She, unlike her husband, had no reason to travel to London. Greeted first with joy, then with alarm at her adventures, most of her female relatives, her husband's sisters included, feeling it necessary to have a fit of the vapours when told of battles, nursing the wounded, imprisonment, and shipwreck. HMS Fury limped up the channel under her stumpy, jury-rigged masts, making slow progress, which was a situation that kept busy every officer on board, so hard was it to keep her on course. Captain Warren was grateful for the addition of those not required to sail the Guiscard. The notion that she should proceed independently had founded on Warren's desire to have her in company in a dangerous stretch of water like the English Channel, just in case his frigate, wallowing, jibbing, and taking in water, needed to be abandoned. But, and to John Pearce's relief, he had put one of his midshipmen in command of her, and invited Pearce to share the frigate's wardroom, given what he had been through. The slow progress frustrated John Pearce as much as his own delay had angered Barclay. He also had the added load, though in truth it was not a terribly onerous one, passed on by a captain too busy to undertake it himself, of keeping entertained General Sir David Rose, Knight of the Bath, and a trencherman who, had his wine been poured into that large receptacle, would have drained it with pleasure, he being a man who appreciated his grub as much as he loved what was necessary to wash it down. Right now he was enjoying a dish of freshly netted sprats, fished for by his servants over the ship's side, alert enough to see them being pursued by a shoal of mackerel.
"God, I have missed these fish," he exclaimed. "They have nothing like them in the waters off India. There are some blessings to a vessel not sailing at speed."
Surprisingly, the general, returning home with a nabob's fortune, turned out to be a man of radical opinions, who, while prepared to vehemently denounce the present barbarity of the French Revolution, was wholly in favour of the things which had brought it about. He also spoke kindly of Adam Pearce, whose writings he had read avidly in the 80s, though he had never heard him speak. He was very like those people Pearce had met with his father, and in whose houses they had stayed, Folk who had all the benefits of a comfortable life, but an acute awareness that it was tenuously held. In short, that all was not as well as it should be in the politics of the nation.
"You met Farmer George, you say, young fellow?"
"I did, sir. It was he who granted me my commission, with many a what.
Man's a fool, of course, as all royals are inclined to be. Ain't their fault, mind. They're surrounded by folk who tell them they're always right. Kiss their bare arse, given half the chance, the courtiers. I must say the king's offspring show a stupidity remarkable, even by the standards of the Hanoverians. It's a blessing monarchs have given up soldiering, otherwise the lives of folk like me would be made a misery. Of course, the Jack Tars were burdened with that idiot William, who should never have been given charge of a bumboat, never mind a warship, the booby. Duke of Clarence my foot, more like the damned Lord of Misrule. Burial in a butt of Malmsey, like his one-time namesake, would be a fitting reward."
"You do not mind serving them, these Hanoverians?" Rose laughed, swallowed a sprat, and took a deep drink to wash it down.
"You won't catch me so easy, young'un. I'm a soldier, and an English one, and for all we has our faults as a nation, and for all things should be altered with rotten boroughs and the like, I know we're better off than many of creation's other children. Remember, I've just come back from India. If you want to see injustice, that is the place to go."
"I was given to understand that if a man wanted to become filthy rich, that is the place to go."
"That, young man, borders on damned cheek,"
Rose replied, though he was grinning as he said it.
"Well, I have been told the way to riches is to be a naval officer and become not more than a licensed pirate. Have a sprat."
"If you don't mind, sir, I'll decline. They're not a fish of which I've ever been fond."
"But they're delicious,"
Rose exclaimed, biting into another, a look of deep pleasure on his ruddy face. "General Rose, Mr. Pearce, sirs," said a midshipman, his head round the door. "Captain's compliments, and we've raised the Needles."
"Epic voyage, my foot!"
Ralph Barclay exclaimed, flapping hard with a copy of the Morning Post, property of Brown's Hotel, where he had taken up residence. It was full of praise for Captain Dawes and the way he had brought home his 2 boats, as well as all his crew, to safety.
"It's not like Bligh in the Pacific, slung off his ship with short commons and thousands of miles to traverse. All Dawes had to do was aim his prow at Polaris and wait till his keel touched bottom."
"The nation needs heroes, sir," said Cornelius Gerson, "and Captain Dawes will serve when there is a lack of others more deserving of praise."
"You read his letter?"
"I did."
"And?"
"I see no purpose, sir, in you attending his court-martial, quite apart from the fact that it is likely to be a formality. No captain can be in difficulty for a ship that caught fire, lest he can be shown to be personally liable. He was not, and you have no knowledge of how the blaze began or what caused it." Devereux, standing a few feet away waiting for the coach that had been ordered, merely twitched his shoulders, grateful for the sight of the conveyance finally arriving, a chaise which was to take them out of town to Hertfordshire and the country residence of the Duke of Portland. His memory of events was vague, yet that would not have fazed him. His ability to forgive himself for his transgressions outweighed any possibility of guilt or confession. Ralph Barclay was helped into the chaise and covered with a blanket to ward off the chill, Gerson with him, while Devereux was obliged to take place on the postilion board at the back, pleased that he had armed himself with some gin to ward off the cold. The captain's wife was sat in her marital home, listening, in truth ignoring, the twittering voices of her husband's trio of silly sisters. To them their brother was the finest man alive, a paragon of every proper virtue, a wit and a sage, who had, they would admit, made a fine marriage, though they were wont to wonder at some of their sister-in-law's more outre connections, hers being a branch of the family with members who raised questions in the article of indebtedness and being in trade. Fortunately, in the main, the relationship was distant enough not to imply damaging consanguinity. To question their opinion of their brother would be fruitless and ongoing, so it was best left. All she could do was avoid joining in the paeans of praise, using a simple, tight smile to pretend agreement. Emily had never thought she would miss being at sea, but she did now, and the option of constant visits to her own family home fell foul of the way they were inclined, indeed eager, to take every opportunity to praise Toby Burns. Her father spoke of his nephew as if his famous bravery was personally connected. Had he not done more to raise the boy than his blood father? Her mother, the actual blood relative, would quietly simper in the pool of reflected glory. This while her daughter seethed, she alone being aware that his supposed heroics were a myth, one she was unable to puncture, for the very simple reason no one would believe her. Finally, John Pearce was able to observe the frigate on which he sailed anchor at Spithead, before being warped into the quayside of the naval dockyard, the Guiscard having been passed over to the agent of the Portsmouth Prize Court for adjudication as to the legitimacy of its capture and an assessment of its value. For him and the men he led, it would bring a tidy sum of money. The priests and nuns were taken in by the local vicar, so it was time to find out from Captain John Warren what would happen next, and the effect it would have on his friends.
"The crew will be paid off from HMS Fury, Mr. Pearce, and while the standing officers will stay with her, as she enters the dockyard for repairs, only those I trust absolutely to rejoin when called back will be allowed to go home. They're my people, after all, and I would not want to lose them to another captain. The rest will be spread throughout the fleet, and that will of course apply to those men from HMS Grampus, though if there are any Captain Dawes values, they will no doubt get a scribe to write to him, so they can seek service on his next commission." "I had hoped that 3 of my fellows could stay aboard, Captain Warren, until I can get them properly executed protections." "You have the order of release from Lord Hood. Do you think it will hold if they are taken up by the press or some crimp?" The smile was grim. "No, Mr. Pearce, but nor can I leave them aboard a vessel which will in days be crawling with dockyard mateys who, I would not be surprised to find, would sell them for a pot of ale." "General's going ashore, sir." Warren grinned. "I can almost feel my liver rejoice. I swear I would be cursed with gout had we had him aboard much longer." "So you risked my liver instead," Pearce responded with wry humour. "You had him for a short while, Mr. Pearce. We had him all the way from Calcutta, and I can tell you the consumption of wine was measured in pipes." "With your permission, I would like to say my farewells too." "You got on with the old rogue?" Warren asked, adding when Pearce nodded, "We all did, you know. He was damn good company." There were 2 carriages and a dray on the quay, a berlin for the general, the dray for his extensive possessions, and an enclosed square conveyance surrounded by broad-shouldered fellows come to carry the Lisbon bullion to London. The goodbyes were as warm-hearted as Warren had said, the crew lining the rigging to cheer Sir David onto his home soil, for quite apart from his good nature, he had left a goodly sum of money for the hands to share. The old man became quite emotional as he shook each hand, extending an invitation to stay with him as a guest should the occasion of need ever arrive. "Right, my friends," Pearce said to the Pelicans once all 3 carriages had departed. "It is the public coach for us, and you are to stay within sight of me at all times. You will not be happy with this when you hear me tell people you are my servants." "Sure," Michael whooped, "they will not be cheered by the way we address you, John boy." Pearce knew they understood, but he said the words anyway. "Behave as if you are servants, for there will be people at each post-house eyeing you. They are a favourite hunting ground for crimps on the road from here to London. Wander, and they might just nab you and hope for the best." Bulstrode Park was a Jacobean pile with later additions, extensive gardens and stretching lawns leading to a fine lake. As they travelled up the drive, passing 6 toiling gardeners, Ralph Barclay could not help but imagine himself in possession of such an estate. This was no new dream, but a common one amongst his breed. All it needed was a Spanish plate ship or a great fleet action, followed by the gratitude of the nation, and any naval officer could live like this.
Expecting to be received with courtesy, the brusque inquiry as to his business from the liveried senior footman who manned the entrance put his teeth on edge and made him growl.
"I have a personal communication for His Grace from Admiral Sir William Hotham."
The superior sniff that received was enough to imply that Hotham might as well be a midshipman. "And your name again?"
"My name again, sir," he barked, to no appreciable effect. "Captain Ralph Barclay."
"I will inform His Grace's secretary that you are here."
"Please ensure His Grace is informed personally, my man."
"That I cannot do, sir, given the Duke is not to be troubled by every Tom, Dick, or Harry who has a letter."
"God, how I miss my arm," Barclay whispered to Gerson. "Given both I'd box his ears."
"Your right would do," Gerson responded, trying and not entirely succeeding in keeping the mirth out of his tone. "Wait here." The footman issued this command as he departed, the two men looking at his back and the gold lacing on his fine livery, in itself expensive enough to keep a normal fellow in food and drink for a month. It was an hour, and a frustrating one at that, before another fellow, just as supercilious but at least not uniformed, came to see them and asked for the letter.
"I was requested, nay ordered by Admiral Hotham to deliver it into His Grace's hand."
Seeing the countenance prepare a refusal, Ralph Barclay added vociferously,
"And I will wait here till doomsday if necessary."
"Very well." Another hour passed before they were called for, this by a different and younger liveried footman, following him through chamber after chamber, each with great framed pictures denoting scenes from classical antiquity, each equipped with fine furnishings and deep patterned carpets, until they were admitted into the presence of the owner of the house, in a finely proportioned drawing-room with long windows overlooking a sloping lawn. Respects paid, the missive was handed over, perused, with the Duke looking up at Ralph Barclay.
"This fellow is,"
the older man said, meaning Gerson.
"My secretary."
"Tell him to leave us." That order, made without so much as a glance at Gerson, was followed by a dismissive wave to his own secretary, who departed, leaving them alone.
"You are aware of the contents?" "No, Your Grace, but I do not have to guess at the sentiments," Barclay replied, adding a lie that could do him no harm. "Sir William and I were quite intimate."
"You were at Toulon." The stump moved sharply. The pain was worth it.
"It is where I lost this."
If he had hoped for sympathy, there was none evident. Long of face, with hooded eyes, the Duke sat on a high-backed chair, dressed in silks of the highest quality and bright colour, merely looked back at Hotham's letter. "Your opinion of the operation?"
"Badly planned and poorly executed."
"You have a gift for brevity, Captain." A hand was waved to indicate ignorance.
"Barclay."
The stump moved again, this time with more care.
"It has, of course, cost me my command."
"And I dare say, when it is healed, you would like another."
"It is my profession, Your Grace."
If he was hoping for a positive response, Ralph Barclay was again disappointed. "There are two things I am plagued by, sir, and the first is those seeking a place. The second is that damned vase my ancestor bought and I let Wedgwood copy, which you had better cast an eye over on the way out. It will save you troubling my door should you ever pass by this way again."
"And your interest, should I seek a ship. Admiral Hotham was most anxious that I should be availed of your good offices."
The reply was given with a sigh. "Leave your name with my secretary." The eyes dropped to the letter again. "Good day, Captain."
"There is one other matter, Your Grace."
"Which is?" The fair copy was produced from Ralph Barclay's pocket with all the flair of a showground conjurer.
This is a copy of a private letter, not an official dispatch, sent by Lord Hood to Mr. Pitt.
Portland lost some of his studied languor then, near to snatching the pages from Ralph Barclay's hand to be quickly read.
"How did you come by this?"
"By luck," Ralph Barclay responded. The look he had been given was one of distaste.
"I take it this is for me to keep?"
"It is."
"Then I think that concludes our business."
"And the matter of another ship when my wound is healed?"
"I dare say the Admiralty will be able to find you something, Captain Barclay, to please me more than you, so you may rest content. Now, if there is nothing else—"
He did ask to look at the Portland vase on the way out, and when he gazed upon it, was happy to own it was an admirable piece of virtue, with the black glass and the fine white classical motifs. But having been treated with such disdain, and that by a man whose power and possessions came by inheritance, not ability, Ralph Barclay had to resist the temptation to smash the damn thing to pieces. Preserved in the bottom of the small ditty bag she had been able to salvage from HMS Grampus lay the court-martial papers Emily Barclay had taken from Heinrich Lutyens' berth, and each night after dinner and alone in her marital bedchamber she would look at them under the light of her candle. Not that she needed to read them over and over again. Once was enough. The conundrum was what to do with them, for the same conditions applied as had the first time she had perused them. The ripples that would flow from outright exposure. Finding life at home stifling, when those she spoke with were not on about her wonderful husband or brave nephew, the conversation tended towards the state of the market for sheep and wool, or how war was driving up the price of everything. She had also found out that despite still being only 18 years of age, her marital status had cut her off from those female friends whose company she had enjoyed prior to her nuptials. The unmarried had not moved on. Their talk was still of prospective husbands, not forgetting the ubiquitous hope for a Prince Charming, while the two that had wed in her absence seemed to have given up all love of flighty or amusing gossip at the altar. Emily knew she had to get away. Things were constraining enough now, but they would be 10 times worse when her husband returned. There was no way she could resubmit to his demands, either domestically or in this room, and that would be a secret not long held, for the house had maids. Maids changed beds, and she knew that the evidence of marital abstinence would be obvious, just as servants, finding stained sheets, were always the first to know of a wife or husband committing adultery, at which point, depending on their relationship to the household, they either gossiped and brought about disclosure, or indulged in quiet blackmail. She could face neither. "To London!" exclaimed her husband's eldest sister, in a voice that implied she was setting out on some dangerous adventure. "You have quite altered my consumption of my breakfast. I shall have dyspepsia all day." "Is it not where my husband is at present?" "Such a journey," twittered another, though judging by the wedge of butter on her muffin, it did not interfere with her stomach. "One I have made before, ladies, so if you do not mind, I will be about the packing of my trunk. I would be obliged if you could send one of the maids down to the Blue Boar to book me a place on the Bath-bound coach." The only pleasure Emily Barclay had enjoyed since returning was the ordering of new clothing, all chalked up to an account which her husband would be required to settle. There was no difficulty in this, not only because of his remitted pay as a captain, but by his letters home and his sister's chatter, the whole town knew he had taken one valuable prize and was in dispute about an even more fabulous East Indiaman as to whether it was salvage, a case which might take years to settle. Credit, however, was plentiful. So it was with a full trunk and some money in her purse, as well as plentiful paper, that she set off for Bath, there to catch the fast 2-day coach to London, using the overnight stop to make a copy of the court-martial evidence. Once at Charing Cross, she hailed a hack to take her to the home of Heinrich Lutyens, having sent a note ahead to say she was taking him up on his invitation, issued at sea, to stay. Welcome over and tea now cold in the pot, she turned to business. Heinrich, I require you to advise me about an attorney at law. The sharp nose went up in the air, and the fish-like eyes narrowed suspiciously. I hope you're not about to take any steps, Emily, which are irrevocable. I'm not yet decided on what I'm going to do, which is why I must consult a lawyer. Will it surprise you to know that I am not acquainted with any who specialize in marital disputes? Then point me towards one whom you trust. She had to avoid his eye when she used that word. Much as she longed to tell him her purpose, to admit that would be to also own up to theft. Heinrich named a man who he knew from school and sent a note round to him to expect a new client. Emily following when he sent back word that he would be delighted to receive her. She was brisk, not wishing to enter into any discussion of the state of her marriage. Mr. Studdert, I need to leave with you this package of papers. You will see I have sealed them, so that not even you are aware of the contents. I take it you have a strong box? A strong room, Mrs. Barclay. I am entrusted with many deeds and wills, so a box would not suffice. I take it you wish me to place them beyond common reach. I do. And that is all you require? For now. Then I am happy to oblige. And payment? For such a meagre service, we can await that. And I suspect you may have of me other requirements in the future. Emily declined to reply to what was an invitation to be open, passing over her sealed bundle. Studdert then led her to the heavy steel door of his strong-room, opened it and let her watch without entering, as he placed them on a shelf already full of bundles of documents tied with red ribbon. Then he locked the door again, before asking her to sit down once more, producing from his coat pocket a small notebook and dipping a quill once he had opened it. Mrs. Barclay, it has been my experience in transactions of this nature that the principal, which in this case is you, may want to send for these papers. In short, to have them collected and brought to you by another hand. So that I know it is indeed you who is seeing their delivery, I require from you a word. A code, if you like. One word? Emily asked. Two, if you prefer, or more. Emily bit her lip in thought, then asked if a name was all right. When Studdert nodded, she said firmly, Pelican. Chapter 21. Even though Parliament was in recess, it took several days to get to see the King's First Lord of the Treasury. Days in lodgings during which Pearce had worried for Charlie and Rufus. A time when Michael, free to move around if he kept his eyes peeled for crimps, went back to the Pelican Tavern to find that Rosie had not only gone, but that she had departed as another's bride. And that, related, cheered Charlie immensely. Pearce had no desire to revisit the place from which he had been pressed, being a tavern he had only frequented once, and then in an emergency. Eventually a messenger came with an invitation to attend at 10 Downing Street, Pitt's official home, where he entered a crowded waiting-room of folk queuing to see the man who controlled the executive power of government, all of whom eyed each other suspiciously, as though they suspected everyone else present of seeking to bypass the proper order of admittance. It was dark before he gained the inner sanctum, and telling that he was the last person waiting. When he exited the antechamber it was empty, and making for the cabinet room he passed, as he did so, a trio of men he took to be departing ministers. "Mr. Pearce, we meet again, which I did not expect. You know Mr. Dundas, of course?" John Pearce nodded to Henry Dundas, sitting while Pitt was standing, wondering if the pair were joined at the hip. On his last meeting with the man he had come to see, Dundas had also been present. He was Pitt's right-hand political ally and, to Pearce, a fellow Scot, the leader of the Caledonian block of MPs in the House of Commons, who voted as he instructed, forming the bedrock of the King's Tory support. He was also a man who had crossed swords with Pearce Senior, and the feeling of no love lost between the two of them was, the son knew, mutual. The contrast was strong. Henry Dundas, florid, brimming with confidence and looking like a voluptuary, was the very image of a politician. Pitt looked more of an aesthete, with his fine-drawn features, slim build and quiet mode of speech. They had several things in common. They were both rabid Tories, utterly ruthless in their management of parliamentary business, and were both three-bottle men when it came to the consumption of claret. That they were drinking now, but there was no offer of wine for John Pearce. "You have, I believe, a letter for me?" "From Lord Hood," Pearce replied, passing over the oilskin pouch. "You've become quite a posty, laddie," Dundas joked as Pitt broke the seal, "taking letters one way and another." "More, I hope, a winged messenger, Mr. Dundas." "I heard you had to paddle, not fly, to get here." "It is enough that I managed." Pitt had obviously developed a way of swift reading, for even at 3 full pages it took him no time at all to digest the contents. Expecting it to be passed to Dundas, Pearce was surprised when it was not. "His lordship also asked me to apprise you of certain other facts." "Indeed?" Pitt demanded, his pale blue eyes open in surprise. "Lord Hood cannot say in a letter the whole of what concerns him in private." "Are you saying he has chosen you as an interlocutor?" Dundas demanded. "Why you?" Pitt demanded when Pearce nodded. "He was anxious that I should back up what he has written with my own observations." "His lordship asks a lieutenant to apply observations?" Pitt inquired. "He feels his words may not convey the seriousness of his difficulties. Being in writing, he will no doubt feel the need to be circumspect." "While you will not be?" "No." "I am curious, Pearce. Why has Lord Hood chosen you?" "Odd as it may seem, sir, he has come to trust me, and we share an interest." "Which is?" "I seek redress, as you may recall, for the illegality of my impressment, while Lord Hood wishes you to know the true nature of his difficulties with Admiral Hotham, delivered in a way that could not in any way compromise the government." Pitt waved the letter. "Which are amply outlined in this, and I might add, Pearce, it is not unusual for military commanders to disagree about how to conduct a campaign." Dundas laughed out loud. "Put 2 generals or admirals in a room, and they will emerge with 3 opinions." "In fact, about 1/10 of those managed by politicians," Pearce snapped, catching Dundas draining his glass, "and all to the detriment of their electors." "Mind your tongue, laddie," Dundas spluttered, his humour evaporating. "You of all people, Mr. Dundas, should not seek that from someone of my parentage. I shut Adam Pearce up more than once, boy, and you're not half the man he was." That got Henry Dundas a look of real venom. He had often wondered who had generated the writs against his father for his attacks on the government. This man sitting before him was as good as telling him he was the prime mover. "If you care to step into Green Park at dawn tomorrow, you will find, in some respects, I am very much more than the man he was." "Now that would be cheering for the ton," Pitt joked, "to observe a pair of sawney jocks seeking to kill each other. Perhaps, given how unpopular your race is in London, I should sell tickets and pay off the national debt." Dundas knew it was a jest and responded in kind. "Which means we would have to leave you English to run the country on your own. A recipe for mayhem." "There are the clever Irish to help." "That is a recipe for disaster." "Or a comedy of errors." "Should I leave?" Pearce demanded, given they were obviously indulging in what was an old game of repartee, and a not entirely sober one at that. "Billy," Dundas called, pulling a face, "we are being rebuked." "I find it hard to believe you have the complete trust of his lordship," Pitt said, not jocular now. "I have performed certain services for him that would lead him to do so." Such as... He did not want to sound boastful about his missions on behalf of Hood, yet Pearce knew he had to build himself up, to make out he was worthy of the attention of the pair he was addressing. So he related the actual events regarding the surrender of the French at Toulon, as well as how close he had come to serious harm, his exploits around Corsica, the missions he had undertaken to La Rochelle, Villefranche, Naples, and Tunis, in a way that established without doubt that Hood had come to see him as his messenger of discretion. "Impressive," Pitt said finally, and then he turned to Dundas. "I should avoid Green Park on the morrow, Harry."
"Quite the warrior,"
Dundas responded, though the look that accompanied the words was not praiseworthy, more disbelief. "So, these private thoughts?" Pitt demanded. Over the weeks he had been at sea, even sometimes in that cutter, he had rehearsed what he was going to say. So he related with some fluency how the court-martial had been fixed by Hotham, with he and the best witnesses sent out of the way by that admiral's order, how the result had been a foregone conclusion. He then added the suspicion that Hotham had, on more than one occasion, sought to put him, as well as the 3 pelicans, in harm's way. Yet that, which had all sounded so clear-cut in his head, now sounded like an extended gripe by a man who saw himself and his friends as victims. "However," he concluded, "I admit that to be speculation and difficult to prove. I say it only to underline that Admiral Hotham will go to any lengths to protect his position. There is no doubt that perjury was not only committed but condoned, if not contrived at, by Admiral Hotham."
"I am at a loss to know why you're telling us all this," Dundas asked.
"So that action can be taken."
"What action?"
"The arraignment of Captain Barclay for perjury and the charge to be levelled against Sir William Hotham of conspiracy to aid in the commission of a felony, which seems to both myself and, I think, to Lord Hood, ample grounds for his removal."
"You do not lack for effrontery," Dundas scoffed. "You wish us to invoke the law on your behalf against not only a post-captain of some seniority, but also a vice-admiral held in high regard by many of our political allies."
"A crime has been committed, and if it does not say so in Lord Hood's letter, it must be implied." "No," said Pitt softly, shaking his head. "May I see?" asked Pearce, holding out his hand. "Most certainly not. You might gossip."
"I hope you know me well enough to be sure I would say nothing."
"Mr. Pearce," Pitt guffawed, "I hardly know you at all." "While I know very well how much dispute there is in the command you mention, it is common talk throughout the fleet." "Then let it stay there." "I am sure if you saw the papers from that travesty of a court-martial you would change your mind." "But I do not have them, and I am unlikely ever to see them," Pitt insisted. "Why not? They are official documents."
"They will go to the Admiralty and be buried there,"
Dundas added. "You are the King's First Minister. You can demand to see them." "But why would I want to?" Pitt asked, his voice low. "For the sake of justice," Pearce replied in a near bellow, which only got him a smile to tell him he could look for no assistance in this room. "A case can still be brought."
"How?"
Dundas replied, finally rising from his chair.
"You have no written evidence, and the witnesses you require to call are 1,000 miles away. You would require a judge to insist they be brought back to England, which would only happen after you had forced the sailors by legal writ to give up the transcript of the court-martial, and it would have to be established as questionable." "The Admiralty will make mincemeat of you, laddie, so I hope you have a deep purse for your legal bills, and a few years to spare to pursue your hopeless case."
Pearce had a vision then of the papers he needed falling apart as sea-water destroyed them. There was nothing he could do. Ralph Barclay would escape the justice he deserved. "I will not let this go, Mr. Pitt." "But I, on the other hand, will let you go," Pitt snapped. "Our business is over."
"Pearce," Dundas said, "wait outside."
"What?" was the reply from a supplicant clearly confused by the request.
"It is the same as Portland sent us?" asked Dundas, reaching for Hood's letter, which Pitt handed to him.
"Precisely, and it will cost Hood his command. Portland will insist on it."
"By damn, I would like to know how that Whig swine got his hands on it."
"Matters not, Harry. He will have Hotham elevated because of what he knows." Pitt sighed. "With this brought by Pearce's hand, its existence and the contents could be denied. Now, if I reject the truth of it, given he has a fair copy, I risk losing his support."
"I don't doubt Hood is telling the truth," Dundas said. "Not that it aids us much."
"Why did you ask Pearce to wait?" That got Pitt a look of disbelief.
"For a party manager, Billy, you're a sad case.
Pearce is a weapon we would be foolish to just dismiss." "You're not suggesting we aid him?"
"We could use him."
"Don't speak," Pitt demanded. "Let me work out your thinking."
"Thank the Lord for that," Dundas replied, sitting again and filling his glass with claret. "All that arguing the toss with Pearce has given me a deep thirst. But I would say just one thing, and it hurts me to do so, given that young man's parentage. I think he is speaking the truth. Oh, and another. He is not as clever as he thinks he is."
William Pitt paced up and down the long room for several minutes, his head bent, occasionally stopping by his claret to take a sip from the glass. Without stopping, he looked up and began to speak. "Portland will demand Hood's head, which we must give him, but a hint at certain irregularities will need to be established before we can agree to elevate Hotham." The nod and satisfied quaff from Dundas was enough of an agreement. "Portland will ask what they are, but we must say they are so unproven as to require the recall of Hood on, say, the grounds of ill health."
"That I had not thought of, but I agree."
"The Duke is bound to make inquiries of his own, and if he has any sense he will smoke what it is we are after, and try to ensure we do not find out the truth. But if you are right about Pearce, we already have it, and the evidence will be in those court-martial papers."
"Your father would be proud of you, Billy."
"Meanwhile, we ensure Portland finds out the truth. To protect himself, he is bound to cover up for Hotham,
which leaves him exposed in the future, and perhaps, as a political ally, more malleable. The facts, passed on to Fox, would bring him low, given he sets himself up as such a paragon."
"The Admiralty will lose the transcript."
"They cannot kill the witnesses."
"The French might."
"Not all of them, Billy, and we have the power to insist they be brought back to England for an inquiry."
"It would not destroy Portland."
"We do not need to destroy him," Dundas insisted. "In fact, if we did that, we would harm ourselves. What we need to do is make him cautious."
"Pearce?"
"We need to get Hood to agree to take leave on the grounds of ill health. He comes home and, after a decent interval, retires from active service. He is, after all, in his 70s.
"And you think Pearce should return to the Mediterranean with that message?"
"If he will agree, which I doubt."
"So much for your plan, Harry."
"Unless you offer him your backing in the matter of the case for perjury."
Seeing Pitt looked surprised, Dundas added,
"Damn it, Billy, you don't have to mean it."
Pitt nodded slowly, having lost any fear of spouting untruths the minute he took up politics. He went to the door himself and called Pearce back in, aware as he did so that he was the object of deep suspicion. Dundas spoke before he could.
"I don't warm to you, laddie. Stop calling me laddie. And I doubt many do, but old Hood seems to have done so, and we require you to aid him in return."
Dundas held up the letter.
"You see, boy, we had already read this letter before you ever came through that door."
"How in the name of—"
"You're not, I hope, with an atheist for a father, going to invoke God. It was copied, and that must have been when it was in your possession."
Stunned, John Pearce could not reply, and it was obvious from his expression he was wondering when, even if he was less doubtful about the whom. "It was then shown to the Duke of Portland," Pitt continued, "and he, knowing it would embarrass us, passed it on. The trouble is, with all these complaints about Hotham out in the open, and the Duke of Portland knowing we are dependent on his support, Lord Hood is vulnerable, and he needs to be told that is the case, but with discretion." "You're not asking me to act as your messenger again?" "There you go, Billy," Dundas cried, slapping the table hard. "I told you he would smoke your wiles." "Naturally, we would not expect you to do this without reward," Pitt said, looking piqued. "The case against Berkeley?" Pitt nodded, and that air of being found out changed to a smile. "What has changed in the last 15 minutes? You were sure it was impossible then." "No, Lieutenant Pearce," Pitt replied, using his rank for the first time, which did not go unnoticed by the recipient. "I told you I was not prepared to pursue it, but it has become plain to me I need your services once more, and I am not fool enough to seek them without payment." "I think we should be honest with you, Pearce," Dundas lied. "It will not be easy. We must proceed with care, for the slightest hint of our aim will bring about the very situation we are seeking to avoid, and block forever any hope you have of redress." "But with a fair wind, and us at your back," Pitt hinted. A hoot came from Dundas. "Damn me, Billy, a nautical simile!" Throughout the conversation, John Pearce's mind had been racing. He did not trust these two one little bit. They might be truthful in what they were saying, or they might not. But with that set of papers at the bottom of the sea, the answer to his problem did not lie here in London. It lay back out there in the Mediterranean. There was also the knowledge, which he had been gnawing at for some time, of his own lack of prospects, as well as that of his companions. While he could not decide for them, he could for himself, and aid them in the process. "I agree, with conditions." Pearce enjoyed the way the two politicians reacted, as though they had just discovered someone had stolen their watch. "I require 2 warrants for arrests squashed, and 3 protections from impressments guaranteed by you." "The Admiralty issues those," Dundas protested. "They will grant them quickly on your demand. I also wish to choose the vessel on which I travel." "You pose a stiff price." "Take it or leave it." Pitt was walking again, head down in a brown study and moving from side to side. "Billy," Dundas said, only to be silenced by a raised hand. "I agree," Pitt said eventually. "Leave the details, the names and crimes with my clerk, and call upon me tomorrow. And let us hope, Mr. Pearce, that what we are about works out for the best." John Pearce nodded and left, leaving the two politicians looking at each other for several seconds until they were sure the sound of footsteps had faded. Then they burst out laughing, Dundas filling their glasses with yet more claret. Both then raised in a silent toast. "That was easier than I thought," said Dundas. "We should get hold of Sheridan and ask to appear at Drury Lane." Eventually, having taken a deep drink, William Pitt replied, "If only our political opponents were as biddable as Lieutenant John Pearce, life would be so much easier." You have been listening to An Ill Wind. It was written by David Donachie and read by Peter Wickham. Other recordings by David Donachie include An Element of Chance, A Hanging Matter, and The Admiral's Game. This has been a Soundings Audiobooks presentation. If you have enjoyed this production, please write to us at Isis House, Kings Drive, Whitley Bay, Tyne and Weir, NE 26 2JT, or call 0191 253 4155 and you will be sent a full list of our recordings.